Hello, travelers of the night, and welcome back to Midnight Lullaby. These stories drift through the static, a signal that drowns out the noise of the waking world and guides you into slumber. Before the signal slips away, leave a trace. Tell me which part of the world you're listening from, so I know how far this broadcast reaches. And if the whispers keep you company, a like and a subscribe help keep the transmission alive. Now, close your eyes, relax. The broadcast begins. My great-grandfather's pocket watch has been my constant companion for 7 years now. Ever since my grandmother pressed it into my palm at his funeral with trembling fingers and whispered, "He would have wanted you to have this. David, you were always his favorite." The watch itself is unremarkable at first glance. A simple silver case worn smooth by generations of handling, with a white porcelain face and elegant black Roman numerals. The crystal is slightly clouded with age, and the second hand moves with a barely audible tick that I've grown to find comforting. It keeps perfect time, never gaining or losing even a second, which is remarkable for a timepiece that must be nearly a century old. I wear it every day, attached to a leather fob that disappears into the watch pocket of my vest, a affectation that my colleagues at the insurance office sometimes tease me about. Who carries a pocket watch anymore, David? They'll say, but there's something about the weight of it, the solid reality of mechanical time, measured in springs and gears, rather than digital pulses, that makes me feel connected to something more permanent than the modern world's electronic precision. The first time I noticed something unusual was during a business trip to Chicago. I'd been traveling more frequently as a claims adjuster, visiting sites of commercial losses, interviewing witnesses, documenting damage. It was the kind of work that required precise timing, appointments with contractors, meetings with business owners, coordination with local authorities. I arrived at O'Hare on a Tuesday morning, checking my watch as I exited the plane, 11:47 a.m. local time. But as I walked through the terminal, pulling my wheeled suitcase behind me, I felt that familiar weight in my vest pocket and instinctively reached for the watch to check the time again. The crystal caught the fluorescent terminal lighting as I opened the case, and I froze mid-stride. The watch read 12 hours and 23 p.m. 6 minutes later than it had been just moments before. 6 minutes later than my phone. Then the digital clocks scattered throughout the airport, then every other timepiece I could see around me. I stopped walking, letting travelers flow around me like water around a stone, and stared at the watch face in confusion. I thought perhaps the movement had been jarred during the flight, despite the watch's legendary reliability. I carefully adjusted it back to match the airport clocks, winding it gently as my great-grandfather had taught me when I was a boy. The familiar resistance of the crown, the soft click of the mechanism engaging, the subtle vibration as the mainspring tightened, all perfectly normal. But throughout that day in Chicago, I found myself checking the watch obsessively, and each time it maintained perfect synchronization with every other clock I encountered. The incident at the airport began to feel like a momentary lapse, easily explained by the stress of travel, or perhaps a minor mechanical hiccup in an otherwise flawless piece of machinery. It wasn't until I was sitting in my hotel room that evening, reviewing my notes from the day's interviews, that I began to understand what had actually happened. The fire I'd been investigating had occurred at 12 hours 23 p.m., exactly the time my watch had shown when I first checked it in the terminal. 36 minutes before the local clocks had reached that moment. The realization sent a cold shiver down my spine that had nothing to do with the hotel's aggressive air conditioning. I sat on the edge of the bed, the watch heavy in my palm, its quiet ticking suddenly seeming louder in the artificial silence of the sealed hotel room. The logical part of my mind, the part trained in careful investigation and rational analysis, immediately began searching for coincidences, for reasonable explanations that didn't involve impossible temporal mechanics. But as the weeks passed and my travels continued, the pattern became undeniable. Every time I arrived in a new city, a new town, a new location where time might somehow flow differently, my great-grandfather's watch would skip forward. Not randomly, not erratically, but with purposeful precision, showing me what time it would be when something significant happened in that place. In Atlanta, the watch jumped forward 18 minutes, matching exactly the moment when the warehouse I was investigating had been struck by lightning. In Denver, 43 minutes, corresponding to the precise time of the gas leak explosion I'd been sent to examine. In Portland, 2 hours and 17 minutes, aligning perfectly with the moment of the industrial accident that had claimed 3 lives and launched a dozen lawsuits. I began documenting these temporal anomalies in a notebook I carried alongside my official investigation materials. The watch wasn't just keeping time. It was keeping true time, the time that mattered. The time when events that would reshape lives and destroy property and alter the course of human stories would unfold in each location I visited. But it was more than just professional catastrophes. In Sacramento, the watch showed the moment when a couple I'd never met would decide to divorce, their marriage crumbling in the aftermath of their business fire. In Phoenix, it predicted the exact minute when a small town mayor would resign in scandal related to the municipal building. Collapse I was investigating in New Orleans, it marked the time when a jazz musician would play his last note before the flood damage to his club forced him to give up his dream forever. The watch was showing me the real time of each place, not the arbitrary measurement of hours and minutes imposed by time zones and atomic clocks, but the organic, emotional time that pulsed beneath the surface of every location. The time that mattered to the people who lived there, who loved there, who suffered there. I started arriving at investigation sites early, positioning myself to observe these predicted moments of significance. And sure enough, at precisely the time my watch had indicated, something crucial would happen. A confession would be made. A critical piece of evidence would be discovered. A witness would remember a detail that changed everything. A relationship would end or begin or transform irrevocably. The watch wasn't just predicting events. It was revealing the temporal heartbeat of places, the rhythm of human consequence that governed real life beneath the mechanical measurement of standard time. Each location had its own temporal signature, its own meaningful moments that my great-grandfather's watch could somehow detect and display. But understanding this gift, if that's what it was, came with a terrible burden. I began to dread checking the time when I arrived somewhere new, afraid of what significance the might reveal, what moment of human pain or loss or transformation I would be compelled to witness. The weight in my vest pocket began to feel less like comfort and more like an anchor, dragging me into the depths of other people's most crucial moments. In Memphis, the watch showed me the time when a young woman would discover her brother's body in the ruins of their family restaurant. In Boise, it marked the moment when an elderly man would realize that the heart attack triggered by seeing his burned workshop meant he would never work with his hands again. In Charleston, it revealed the exact minute when a mother would understand that her child's burns from the hotel fire would leave permanent scars. I found myself lingering at these scenes, longer than necessary for my official reports, drawn by a morbid fascination with the temporal precision of human tragedy. The watch had made me a witness to the exact moments when lives changed forever, when futures were rewritten, when the careful plans people had made for themselves crumbled into ash and insurance claims. But the most disturbing realization came gradually, through careful analysis of my notebook entries and the patterns they revealed. The watch wasn't just showing me the true time of events in each location. It was showing me the time according to someone else's experience of that place. In every city, every town, every site I investigated, there had been someone whose life was so fundamentally connected to that location that they had become part of its temporal signature. The watch was reading time according to their internal clock, their emotional relationship with the place, their deep personal investment in what happened there. The warehouse owner whose life's work went up in flames, the restaurant family whose heritage burned with their building, the jazz musician whose club was his whole world. The watch was somehow tuning into their experience of time, their perception of when moments truly mattered, and reflecting that back to me through its antique mechanism, which meant that somewhere, in each place I visited, someone's consciousness was so deeply embedded in the location that they had become its temporal reference point. Someone whose heartbeat had synchronized with the rhythm of that particular piece of the world, whose personal timeline had become the true measure of time for that place. And if the watch could read their time, if it could tap into their experiential relationship with location and moment, what did that mean about the nature of consciousness itself? What did it mean about the way human awareness could spread beyond the boundaries of individual skulls and become part of the places we love, the buildings we create, the spaces we inhabit with such intensity that we leave temporal imprints on reality itself? I started researching my great-grandfather's history, looking for clues about how he might have acquired such an unusual timepiece. What I found was a man who had spent his entire life as a traveling salesman, moving from town to town, city to city, building relationships and learning the intimate rhythms of dozens of communities across the country. He had been, in essence, a collector of temporal signatures, a man who understood that real time was emotional time, personal time, the time that flows according to human investment rather than atomic precision. The watch had been his tool for understanding the places he visited, for tuning into the temporal heartbeats of communities, for knowing when the significant moments would occur. And now it was mine, passed down through generations along with the terrible gift of witnessing the exact moments when lives change forever. But lately, I've begun to notice something new. In my own apartment, in my familiar neighborhood, the watch has started jumping forward occasionally. Just a few minutes here and there, but enough to make me wonder what significant moment is approaching in my own life. What transformation is the watch detecting in my personal timeline? And more disturbing still, if the watch reads the temporal signature of someone deeply connected to each place, whose time is it reading when I'm at home? Have I become so invested in my own small corner of the world that I've created a temporal imprint there? Or is it reading someone else's time? Someone whose connection to my neighborhood, my building, my life is so deep that they've become part of its temporal fabric. The watch ticks steadily in my vest pocket as I write this, measuring moments with mechanical precision while carrying the weight of impossible knowledge. Tomorrow, I fly to Seattle for another investigation, another opportunity to witness the exact moment when someone's carefully constructed world will crumble into the kind of loss that generates insurance claims and newspaper headlines. But tonight, as I pack my suitcase and prepare for another journey into someone else's temporal heartbeat, I find myself wondering if the watch has been changing me. All these months of witnessing crucial moments, of standing at the precise intersection of human catastrophe and temporal significance, have begun to alter my relationship with time itself. I notice that I no longer wear a wristwatch. My phone's digital clock feels increasingly irrelevant. A meaningless measurement that has nothing to do with the real flow of time. Only my great-grandfather's pocket watch seems to understand that time isn't uniform, isn't constant, isn't the same for everyone everywhere. Time is personal, emotional, tied to the depth of our connection to places and people and moments that define our existence. Sometimes I catch myself checking the watch compulsively, even when I'm nowhere near a significant location, hoping it might reveal something about the temporal currents flowing beneath the surface of ordinary moments. But in familiar places, how surrounded by routine, the watch keeps perfect synchronization with every other timepiece, as if it's waiting for me to enter a space charged with enough emotional significance to warrant its special attention. The strangest part is how this knowledge has begun to affect my perception of the people around me. When I walk through my neighborhood, I find myself wondering about their temporal signatures, their personal relationships with time and place. The elderly man who sits on his porch every morning at exactly 7:30 is his internal clock so precisely calibrated to this location that he's become part of its temporal fabric. The young mother who hurries past my window at the same time every weekday, pushing her stroller with urgent determination. What crucial moments in her life have synchronized with this particular stretch of sidewalk? And what about the people I investigate professionally? When I interview witnesses to fires and accidents and industrial disasters, I'm no longer just gathering facts for insurance reports. I'm studying their faces for signs of temporal displacement, for the particular kind of disorientation that comes from having your personal timeline disrupted by catastrophic events. I'm listening for the moments when their voices change, when they describe not just what happened, but when it happened in their internal experience of time. because I've learned that official timestamps, the ones recorded by security cameras and phone logs and computer systems, rarely match the temporal reality experienced by people whose lives are torn apart by sudden disaster. Their time moves differently in those crucial moments, stretching and compressing according to the emotional weight of what they're experiencing. The watch understands this. The watch reads true time, human time, the time that matters. But this understanding comes with a price that grows heavier with each passing day. I've become a temporal voyeur, a collector of other people's most significant moments, and I'm beginning to lose track of my own relationship with time. When did I last experience a moment so emotionally charged, so personally significant, that it might register on the watch as a temporal landmark? When did my own life last generate the kind of meaningful time that the watch seems designed to detect? The realization that I might be losing my own temporal significance, even as I document everyone else's, is more disturbing than any of the impossible mechanics of the watch itself. I'm becoming a ghost in my own timeline, a witness to everyone else's crucial moments, while my own life flows by in the kind of ordinary time that leaves no temporal fingerprints on reality. But perhaps that's the true gift my great-grandfather left me. Not just the ability to witness the moments when other people's lives change forever, but the gradual understanding that time itself is more fluid, more personal, more intimately connected to consciousness than I ever imagined. Perhaps he spent his life as a traveling salesman, not just to earn a living, but to collect these temporal experiences, to understand how human awareness can become so deeply embedded in places that it alters the very flow of time itself. The watch in my pocket has become more than a timepiece. It's a compass for navigating the hidden temporal geography of human experience, a tool for finding the moments when life becomes most intensely itself. And maybe that's enough. Maybe being a witness to these crucial intersections of time and consciousness is its own form of temporal significance, its own way of becoming part of the larger rhythm that governs when things truly matter. Tomorrow in Seattle. I'll open the watch case as I exit the plane, and it will show me a time that doesn't match the airport clocks. I'll document that time in my notebook, and then I'll position myself to witness whatever moment of transformation it predicts. I'll watch someone's life change forever at precisely the moment my great-grandfather's watch has indicated, and I'll try to understand what that means about the nature of time, consciousness, and the invisible threads that connect us all to the places where we invest our deepest emotional energy. And maybe, if I'm very careful, if I pay close enough attention to the lessons the watch is teaching me about the relationship between time and human significance, I might learn how to create my own temporal landmarks, my own moments charged with enough meaning to register on reality's deeper clocks. Until then, I carry the weight of inherited time in my vest pocket, feeling its steady tick against my chest like a second heartbeat, marking moments with mechanical precision while revealing truths about the nature of time itself that no atomic clock could ever measure. The watch knows something about time that the rest of the world has forgotten, and it's teaching me, one impossible moment at a time, to see the hidden temporal architecture that underlies every human story. The true time is never what the clocks say it is. The true time is always when it matters most. Story 2. The pedestrian tunnel beneath 5th Street has always been a convenient shortcut, especially on nights like this, when the October rain turns the sidewalks into rivers, and the wind carries the sharp promise of winter. I've walked through it hundreds of times over the past 2 years since taking the job downtown, a simple concrete tube lined with flickering fluorescent lights, connecting the financial district to the residential area where I rent my small apartment. Tonight, though, something feels different about the tunnel. It starts with my footsteps. The sound is wrong somehow, not quite synchronized with my movement. I stop walking to listen, and for just a moment, I swear I hear one additional step echo in the darkness behind me, before the silence settles around me like a held breath. I shake my head and continue walking. It's late, nearly midnight, and I'm tired from another long day of staring at spreadsheets and pretending to care about quarterly projections. My imagination is simply filling the empty tunnel with phantom sounds, the way it sometimes fills empty houses with ghost voices or dark corners with watching eyes. But there it is again, that extra step, falling just a fraction of a second after mine, as if someone is walking behind me and trying to match my pace, but not quite managing it. I turn around, squinting into the dim tunnel behind me. The fluorescent lights create pools of harsh white illumination separated by pockets of shadow, but I can see all the way to the entrance. The tunnel is empty except for me. When I resume walking, the sound continues. Step, step. My feet on the concrete. Step, step. The echo that doesn't quite belong. It's subtle enough that I might convince myself I'm imagining it, except for the way it makes my skin crawl, the way it triggers some primal instinct that whispers something is wrong, something is following, something is hunting. I try changing my pace. When I walk faster, the phantom steps speed up too, but they maintain that slight delay, that off rhythm that makes them sound like an imperfect shadow of my own movement. When I slow down, they slow down with me. When I stop completely, there's always that one extra step echoing through the tunnel before silence falls. The tunnel seems longer tonight than usual. I know it's only about 200 feet from entrance to exit, a distance I can normally cover in less than 2 minutes. But tonight it stretches ahead of me like a throat, the exit visible as a pale circle of streetlight that never seems to get any closer, no matter how long I walk, and the footsteps behind me are getting louder. I turn around again, more quickly this time, hoping to catch whatever is making the sound. But the tunnel behind me is still empty, still lit by those same flickering, fluorescent bulbs that buzz and hum with electrical complaints. The sound of my own breathing seems unnaturally loud in the confined space, mixing with the distant hum of traffic from the street above and the steady drip of water from somewhere in the darkness. Hello. I call out, feeling foolish as soon as the word leaves my mouth. My voice echoes strangely in the confined space, bouncing off the concrete walls in ways that make it hard to tell where the original sound ends and the echo begins. For a moment, it almost sounds like multiple voices calling back to me from different parts of the tunnel. No response, except the echo of my own voice, growing fainter with each repetition until it fades into silence. But in that silence, I hear something that makes my blood freeze. The sound of breathing that isn't mine, coming from somewhere behind me in the tunnel. I start walking faster, my footsteps echoing off the walls with increasing urgency. Behind me, the phantom footsteps keep pace, and now I can hear that other breathing more clearly, deeper than mine, more labored, as if whoever is following me is having trouble keeping up, but refuses to fall behind. The exit still looks impossibly far away, but I force myself not to run. Running would be an admission that something is really wrong here, that this isn't just my imagination creating patterns in random sounds. Running would mean accepting that something is hunting me in this tunnel, something that matches my pace and breathes with my rhythm, but stays just out of sight in the shadows between the lights. So I walk, counting my steps to distract myself from the fear that's building in my chest like pressure behind a dam. 1, 2, 3, 4. My footsteps, sharp and echoing. 5, 6, 7, 8. The other footsteps following like a faithful dog. 9, 10, 11, 12. That other breathing. Getting closer, getting hungrier. At step 57, I realize I've been walking for nearly 10 minutes without getting any closer to the exit. The tunnel is somehow extending itself, stretching like taffy, keeping me trapped in this concrete tube with whatever is following me. The fluorescent lights flicker more frequently now, creating a stuttering rhythm that makes the shadows dance and twist in ways that hurt to look at. I stop walking and turn around one more time. This time I see it. A figure stands about 20 feet behind me, just at the edge of one of the pools of light. It's tall and thin, wearing what looks like a long coat that might once have been dark blue, but now appears to be the color of old blood. Its face is in shadow, but I can see the pale gleam of eyes watching me with an intensity that makes my skin crawl. We stare at each other for a moment that feels like hours. The figure doesn't move, doesn't speak, just watches me with those pale eyes. But I can hear it breathing, that deep, labored sound that I've been hearing behind me for the past 10 minutes. Each breath sounds wet, as if something inside its chest is broken and leaking. "What do you want?" I manage to ask, my voice smaller and more frightened than I intended. The figure tilts its head slightly, like a dog hearing an interesting sound. When it opens its mouth to respond, no words come out, just a sound like wind rushing through empty spaces, like the sigh of air escaping from something that has been holding its breath for far too long. And then it starts walking toward me. Its footsteps are wrong in a way that makes my brain hurt to process. They're too heavy for the figure's apparent weight, too slow for its pace, too numerous for the number of legs I can see. It sounds like several people walking in almost perfect synchronization, but not quite, creating a rhythm that's similar to normal footsteps but subtly, horribly different. I turn and run. The tunnel ahead of me seems to telescope and contract with each step, the exit rushing toward me and then receding like a mirage. Behind me, I can hear that impossible walking sound getting faster, keeping pace with my sprint, but maintaining that awful, wrong rhythm. The fluorescent lights begin to flicker more rapidly, creating a strobe effect that turns my running into a series of still photographs, tunnel, shadow, light, tunnel, shadow, light. And in one of those freeze frame moments, I see something that makes me stumble and nearly fall. In the reflection of a puddle on the tunnel floor, I can see myself running, but there are two figures behind me. One is the tall, thin figure in the dark coat. The other is me, running in perfect synchronization with my own movements, but somehow delayed by just a fraction of a second. That's when I understand what's been following me. It's not another person or some supernatural creature stalking through the tunnel. It's my own echo, somehow become physical, somehow given form and substance, and its own terrible purpose. The footsteps I've been hearing are my footsteps, delayed and distorted by the tunnel's acoustics until they've become something separate from me, something that exists in the space between sound and silence. I stop running and turn to face the approaching figure. As I watch, it shifts and wavers like heat mirage, and for a moment I can see through its dark coat to the tunnel wall behind it. It's not solid, it's made of sound waves and reflected light, of echoes and shadows, given just enough substance to be visible, to be heard, to be feared. You're me, I say, and my voice echoes strangely in the tunnel, creating harmonics that make the words sound like a question and an answer at the same time. The figure stops walking and nods slowly. When it speaks, its voice is my voice, but processed through the tunnel's acoustics until it sounds hollow and distant. I'm what you leave behind every time you walk through here. A little piece of sound, a fragment of motion, a echo that never quite fades. What do you want? To be whole again? To stop being just an echo, just a reflection, just a shadow cast by someone who doesn't even know I exist. The figure takes a step closer, and now I can see that its face is my face, but older, more tired, worn down by existing in the spaces between sounds. Every night you walk through here, you create me again. Every night I follow you, trying to catch up, trying to merge back into the person who cast me. I back away, but there's nowhere to go. The tunnel stretches infinitely in both directions now. No entrance, no exit, just this concrete tube filled with flickering lights and the echoes of echoes. But you can never catch up. I realize you're always going to be a fraction of a second behind, always going to be out of sync. Unless you stop, the figure says, taking another step closer. Unless you turn around and walk back toward me instead of away. Unless you let me close the distance between what you are and what you've left behind. I consider this. The figure is close enough now that I can see the details of its face, my face, but somehow sadder, more hollow, as if it's been stretched thin by existing in the spaces between heartbeats. Its breathing is labored, because it's trying to breathe air that isn't quite there, trying to exist in moments that have already passed. What happens if I let you catch up? Then there won't be any more echoes, no more phantom footsteps, no more sounds that don't belong to the person making them. We become one again, the way we're supposed to be. The figure extends a hand that looks like mine, but feels cold when it brushes against my arm. Or you keep running, and I keep following, night after night, getting a little more solid each time, a little more real, until eventually I don't need you to exist anymore. The tunnel around us pulses like a heartbeat. The fluorescent lights dimming and brightening in rhythm with some unseen circulation. I can feel the weight of all the nights I've walked through here, all the echoes I've left behind without realizing it. Each footstep, each breath, each word I've spoken to myself in the tunnel's confines has contributed to this moment, has fed this shadow version of myself until it's become strong enough to demand my attention. How long have you been following me? I asked. Since the first night you walked through here. 2 years, 3 months, 16 days. I've counted every step, every breath, every heartbeat that you've left behind in this place. The figure's voice is getting stronger, more solid, as if our conversation is feeding it somehow. Do you remember that first night? You were nervous about the new job, worried about fitting in, scared that you'd made a mistake taking the position downtown. I do remember. The October rain, just like tonight. The uncertainty about my decision to move to the city, to take a job that paid well, but left me feeling empty and disconnected. I'd walked through the tunnel quickly that first night, eager to get home and second. Guess my choices in private. You talked to yourself that night. The figure continues. You said, "What am I doing here? What have I gotten myself into?" And your words echoed off these walls, bounced back and forth, until they became something separate from you. That's when I was born in the space between your question and your echo's answer. The memory feels different now, tainted by the knowledge that I wasn't as alone as I'd thought. Every night since then, I've walked through this tunnel carrying on conversations with myself, muttering about work frustrations, humming songs, sometimes even practicing presentations out loud. And all of it has been feeding this echo version of myself, giving it substance and purpose. You've been listening to everything, I say, and it's not a question. I've been living everything, just a fraction of a second behind you. Every worry, every fear, every moment of loneliness you've experienced in this tunnel, I've experienced too. But while you get to leave, I have to stay here, trapped in the echo of your emotions, replaying them over and over until the next night when you add more to the collection. I look around the tunnel, seeing it differently now. The concrete walls aren't just barriers between me and the outside world. They're repositories of sound, holding on to every noise that's ever been made here, layering them like sediment until they become something more than just acoustic phenomena. The flickering lights aren't malfunctioning fixtures. They're responding to the accumulated electrical activity of all the thoughts and emotions that have passed through this space. What do you want me to do? I ask. Stop walking away from me. Turn around. Come back. The figure's eyes, my eyes, are pleading now, desperate in a way that makes my chest tight with sympathetic pain. Let me catch up. Let me be part of you again, instead of just your discarded shadow. I consider this, but something about the proposal makes me uneasy. What happens to me if we merge? Do I stay myself, or do I become something else? The figure hesitates, and in that hesitation, I see the truth. You become more complete, it says finally. You become someone who doesn't leave pieces of himself behind everywhere he goes. Someone who doesn't fragment with every step. That's not an answer. It's the only answer I can give you. I don't know what happens when an echo rejoins its source. I only know that the current situation is unbearable, existing in the spaces between moments. Breathing air that's already been breathed. Walking steps that have already been taken. I close my eyes and try to imagine what it would feel like to reintegrate with my own echo. Would I remember all the nights this shadow version of me has spent alone in the tunnel? Would I feel the accumulated weight of 2 years worth of loneliness and repetition? Or would the merger be seamless, natural, like putting on a piece of clothing that fits perfectly? When I open my eyes again, the figure is closer. Close enough that I can see the exhaustion in its face, the way the fluorescent light passes through it in some places and reflects off it in others. It's not quite solid, not quite transparent, something between the two, like a person-shaped column of disturbed air. I have another proposal, I say slowly. What if instead of merging, I just stop using the tunnel? I could take the long way home, around the block instead of through here. Then you wouldn't have to follow me anymore. You could rest. The figure shakes its head. I can't rest. I'm bound to this place by the sounds and echoes that created me. Even if you never walked through here again, I'd still be trapped, replaying the same 2 years of conversations and footsteps until I eventually fade away completely. And fading away isn't the same as resting. It's like dying very, very slowly. The tunnel around us seems to be listening to our conversation, the walls leaning in slightly, as if they're interested in the outcome. I realize that this place has probably seen similar confrontations before other late. Night walkers meeting their accumulated echoes, other shadow selves demanding recognition and integration. How many others? I ask, gesturing to the tunnel walls. You're the first to see me clearly enough to have this conversation. Most people sense something wrong, but dismiss it as imagination. They hurry through, trying not to think about the extra footsteps or the breathing that isn't quite their own. The figure pauses, then adds quietly. But there are others here. Older echoes from people who used this tunnel years ago, before the renovation project rerouted most of the foot traffic. They've been here so long they've forgotten what their original voices sounded like, as if summoned by the mention. I begin to hear them, faint whispers in the distance. Conversations that might have happened decades ago, still bouncing between the walls in endless repetition. A woman discussing grocery lists with herself. A man practicing a speech for his daughter's wedding. Children playing word games to pass the time during a long walk. All of them trapped in the acoustic memory of this place. All of them gradually fading, but never quite disappearing. They're waiting for something. I realize. They're waiting for someone to acknowledge them, to recognize that they existed, that they were real, that their words and thoughts and fears mattered enough to leave a permanent mark on the world. The figure reaches out again, and this time its hand feels almost solid against mine. That's all any echo wants: recognition, validation, the chance to be heard. I understand now why the tunnel felt different tonight, why my phantom follower finally became visible. It wasn't getting stronger. I was finally ready to acknowledge it, to admit that my nighttime walks through this place have created something beyond my own footsteps and breathing. If I acknowledge you, if I recognize that you're real and that you matter, will that be enough? Will that let you rest? The figure considers this, its form flickering slightly in the fluorescent light. I don't know. It might be. Or it might just make me stronger, more real, until I don't need your acknowledgement anymore to exist. That's a risk I'll have to take, I say, because I can't let you merge with me, and I can't abandon you here to fade away slowly. But I can listen to you. I can remember you. I can carry the knowledge of your existence with me when I leave this place. I sit down on the tunnel floor, the concrete cold and damp beneath me. The figure sits across from me, its movements creating small ripples in the air like heat mirage. For the first time since this strange encounter began, the distance between us stops fluctuating. We're exactly the right space apart for a conversation. Tell me about the past 2 years, I say. Tell me about the nights I left you here alone, about the echoes you've collected, about the other shadow selves you've encountered. I want to hear everything. The figure begins to speak, its voice growing steadier and more solid with each word. It tells me about lonely midnight conversations that echoed long after I'd left the tunnel, about fragments of songs that took on lives of their own in the acoustic spaces between the walls, about the gradual accumulation of emotion and memory that eventually gave it consciousness. As it speaks, I realize that this isn't just my shadow. It's a record of who I've been during some of my most vulnerable moments, when I thought I was alone and safe to express my fears and doubts out loud. In a strange way, it knows me better than anyone else ever has, because it's made entirely of the thoughts and feelings I've never shared with another living person. The story takes hours to tell, or maybe minutes. Time moves differently in the tunnel, following the rhythm of echoes rather than the steady progression of seconds and minutes. But eventually, the figure's voice begins to fade, becoming more and more like an actual echo, until I can barely distinguish its words from the natural acoustic properties of the space. "Thank you," it whispers, and the words bounce off the walls one final time before disappearing completely. I'm alone in the tunnel again, sitting on the cold concrete floor beneath flickering fluorescent lights. But the space feels different now, quieter in some ways, but also more alive, as if it's filled with the gentle breathing of something that's finally at rest. When I stand up and begin walking toward the exit, my footsteps sound exactly like footsteps should sound one person walking through a concrete tunnel, creating echoes that fade naturally and completely with each step. No phantom sounds, no extra breathing, no sense of being followed by my own discarded shadow. But I carry something new with me as I emerge into the October night. The memory of a conversation with a part of myself I never knew existed. The knowledge that even our most private moments leave traces in the world. And the strange comfort of knowing that nothing we say or do ever truly disappears. It just finds new forms, new ways of existing, new spaces to call home. The tunnel will always be there, connecting one part of my life to another. And now, I know that it holds more than just the convenience of a shortcut. It holds the accumulated weight of everyone who has ever walked through it. Everyone who has ever spoken their fears to the darkness and trusted the echoes to keep their secrets safe. Tonight, for the first time in 2 years, I take the long way home. Story 3. The elevator hums its familiar tune as I step inside. The fluorescent light casting that sterile glow I've grown accustomed to over my 3 years working in this building. 27 floors of glass and steel, reaching toward a sky that always seems just out of reach. My fingers hover over the button panel, muscle memory guiding me to the familiar indentation of 15. My floor, my desk, my small corner of this towering maze. But tonight, something catches my eye. There, beneath the basement buttons B1, B2, and B3, sits another button, B4. The brass gleams dully under the harsh light, as if it's been there forever, waiting. The metal feels warm beneath my fingertip as I trace its edges. Strange. I've ridden this elevator hundreds of times, maybe thousands. I know every scratch on these walls, every whisper of the cables overhead, every subtle vibration that signals we're passing the 14th floor. There has never been a B4 button. The elevator lurches slightly as it begins its ascent, and I find myself staring at that impossible button. The brass catches the light differently than the others, older somehow, more worn, as if countless fingers have pressed it before mine. The thought sends a chill down my spine that has nothing to do with the building's aggressive air conditioning. I reach the 15th floor, and the doors slide open with their usual mechanical sigh. But I don't step out. Instead, I let the doors close again, feeling the elevator's gentle bounce as it settles. My hand moves almost without my permission, my index finger extending toward that mysterious 4th basement button. The metal is surprisingly warm. I press it. The elevator doesn't move for a moment, as if considering my request. Then, with a sound I've never heard before, a deeper hum, almost like a satisfied purr, it begins to descend. Past the lobby, past B1, where they keep the building's mechanical systems, past B2 with its storage units and forgotten furniture, past B3 and its maze of parking spaces that never seem quite full enough. And then, impossibly, further down, the numbers on the display flicker as we pass B3. For a moment they show B4, glowing red instead of the usual green. Then they settle, steady and sure, as if they've always shown B4, as if questioning this descent would be absurd. The doors open to reveal a hallway I've never seen before. The walls are the same beige as the rest of the building, but the fluorescent lights flicker with an irregular rhythm that makes shadows dance at the edges of my vision. The air tastes different here, older, heavier, with an undertone of something I can't quite identify. It's not unpleasant, exactly, but it's definitely not the recycled office air I'm used to breathing. I step out, and the elevator doors close behind me with a finality that makes my heart skip. The sound of the elevator ascending feels distant, muffled, as if I'm hearing it through water. The hallway stretches in both directions, lined with doors that look identical to the ones on every other floor. Frosted glass panels, brass nameplates, the usual corporate anonymity. But the nameplates are blank, reflecting the flickering light like empty eyes. I walk to the nearest door and peer through the glass. The office beyond is dark, but I can make out the familiar shapes of desks and chairs, computer monitors dark and silent. It looks exactly like the office on the 15th floor. My office. I try the handle. The door opens with a soft click, and I step inside. The layout is identical, same desk placement, same view of the city through windows that shouldn't exist 4 floors underground. But when I look out those windows, I see not the familiar skyline, but an inverted mirror of it. The same buildings, the same lights, all hanging upside down like stalactites in a vast, dark cave. My breath fogs the glass as I lean closer, and in that brief cloud of condensation, I see words appear as if written by an invisible finger. You're late. I jerk back, my heart hammering against my ribs. The words fade as quickly as they appeared, leaving only the impossible inverted cityscape beyond. I back away from the window, bumping into the desk behind me. But it's not just any desk, it's my desk. My coffee mug sits in its usual spot, still warm to the touch. My nameplate reads the same name I've carried my entire life, but the letters seem to shift slightly when I'm not looking directly at them. The computer monitor flickers to life without my touching it. The familiar startup chime echoes in the empty office, but it plays backward, creating an eerie descending melody that makes my skin crawl. The desktop appears, showing files I recognize, but with timestamps from tomorrow, next week, next year. One file name catches my eye, day 1, 247 in B4. I don't remember creating that file. I click on it, and a text document opens, filled with entries in handwriting that looks like mine, but somehow older, more tired. Day 1 teen found the B4 button. Couldn't resist. Big mistake. Or biggest opportunity. Day 15 the work is the same, but the windows show things that aren't there. Or maybe things that are more real than what we see upstairs. Day 100 started to forget why I wanted to leave. The elevator comes when called, but the B4 button only works one way. Day 500 had a visitor today. Looked exactly like me, but claimed to work on the 15th floor. Funny. I told him I work on the 15th floor too. Day 1 Zaulersen, beginning to suspect there might not be a 15th floor. The entries continue, each one more unsettling than the last. My hands shake as I scroll through what appears to be my own handwriting documenting a year, and more of living here, working here. I look around the office again, noting details I missed before. A coffee ring stain on the desk that matches the one on my desk upstairs. A jacket hanging on the back of the chair, the same jacket I'm wearing. A plant by the window, the same plant I water every morning on the 15th floor, but this one is somehow healthier, more vibrant. I hear footsteps in the hallway. Measured, even steps that sound familiar. I peek through the frosted glass door and see a figure walking past tall, wearing a dark suit, carrying a briefcase. It's me, but older somehow, moving with the confidence of someone who knows exactly where they're going and has been going there for a very long time. The footsteps stop outside my door. A gentle knock, the same rhythm I use when visiting colleagues upstairs. The door handle turns, and I watch myself enter the room. But this version of me doesn't seem surprised to see me here. Instead, he nods, as if we've had this meeting before. As if this is all perfectly normal. "You found the button," he says, and his voice is mine, but with an echo I don't recognize. "There isn't supposed to be a B4, I manage to say, my voice smaller than I intended. He smiles, and it's the same smile I see in mirrors, but somehow sadder. There's always supposed to be a B4. The question is whether you're ready for it. Ready for what? To understand that the 15th floor was never real. None of the floors above ground level are real. This is where the real work happens. This is where we've always worked. I shake my head, backing toward the impossible window. That's not true. I have a life up there. I have memories. He finishes gently. Implanted memories of a surface world that exists only to give us something to believe we're returning to. But look around you. Really look. This is your desk. This is your coffee mug. This is your jacket. This is your handwriting in that journal. You've been here for 247 days, and today is the day you finally remember. The fluorescent lights flicker more rapidly now, and in their strobing illumination, I see the office change. The walls breathe slightly, expanding and contracting like living tissue. The keyboard under my fingers feels warm and slightly damp like skin. The screen shows not files and folders, but a network of tunnels and chambers, a vast underground complex that stretches far beyond what any building should contain. What kind of work? I whisper. He moves to the window and looks out at the inverted city, the kind that keeps the surface world stable, the kind that processes the dreams and fears and forgotten moments of everyone above. We're the foundation, literally and figuratively. We keep everything from falling into the dark. I follow his gaze to the upside, down cityscape. Now I can see that it's not inverted at all. We're looking up at it from below, through layers of earth and concrete and reality itself. The lights aren't electric. They're the accumulated hopes and dreams of the people above, filtered down through 7 floors of office space and bureaucracy, until they reach us, concentrated and pure. How long have I really been here? I ask. Time works differently in B4. You've been here as long as you need to be, and you'll be here as long as you're needed. He pauses, then adds quietly, the elevator works both ways, but only if you remember why you wanted to leave in the first place. I close my eyes and try to remember. My apartment, small and cramped but mine. My cat, Mr. Whiskers, who always greets me at the door. My sister's birthday next week. Coffee with friends on Saturday mornings. But the memories feel thin, like photographs left too long in the sun. When I try to focus on specific details, they blur and shift. Are they real? I ask. As real as anything else, but they're not where you belong. He moves to the desk and picks up a pen, my pen, the one with the chipped blue cap that I've been meaning to replace for months. He adds a new entry to the journal. Day 1, 247 day. Finally met myself. Finally ready to remember. The work begins again tomorrow. The lights stabilize, and the office settles into its normal proportions. Through the window, the inverted city pulses gently with its borrowed light. In the distance, I can hear the elevator arriving, its mechanical song slightly different now, more welcoming. Will I remember this conversation tomorrow? I ask. You'll remember what you need to remember. The surface world will still be there if you need to visit it. But you'll know it for what it is now, a shadow of this place. A simplified version designed to make sense to minds that aren't ready for the complexity of what we do here. I look at the computer screen, at the network of tunnels and chambers that stretch impossibly far in all directions. Each node pulses with a different color, a different frequency. Dreams from the sleepers above, fears from the worried, hopes from the desperate. All of it flowing down to us, to be sorted and processed, and sent back up in forms that won't drive people insane with their beauty and terror. It's important work, I say, and I mean it. The most important work. He heads toward the door, then pauses. Oh, and don't worry about Mr. Whiskers. He's in good hands. The version of you that goes home tonight will remember to buy the good cat food. The door closes behind him with a soft click, leaving me alone in my office 4 floors beneath the earth, surrounded by the gentle hum of machinery that processes the collective unconscious of an entire city. I sit down at my desk, my real desk, and begin to work. Outside the window, the inverted city twinkles with dreams, that taste like starlight and smell like hope. And somewhere above, in an elevator that serves 7 floors of manufactured reality, a button marked B4 waits patiently for the next person brave enough to press it. The work is never finished, but it's always exactly what needs to be done. And tomorrow, when I wake up in an apartment that exists primarily as a rest area between shifts, I'll remember just enough to find my way back to where I truly belong. After all, someone has to keep the lights on in the world above. Someone has to make sure the dreams find their way home. Story 4. The abandoned school sits at the end of Maple Street like a broken tooth, its red brick facade crumbling in places where ivy has taken hold and begun its slow, patient work of reclamation. I've walked past it hundreds of times over the past 6 months since moving to this quiet suburban neighborhood, but I've never ventured inside. Today feels different, though. Today the autumn air carries a strange electricity, and the late afternoon light filters through the dusty windows in a way that makes the empty building seem almost inviting. The front doors are chained shut, but I know from the local teenagers' whispered conversations that there's a way in through the basement window on the west side. I'm not sure why I care. I'm 34 years old, with a perfectly comfortable house just 3 blocks away, and no particular interest in urban exploration. But something draws me to the building today, a pull I can't quite explain or resist. The basement window is indeed unlocked, its frame swollen with years of moisture and neglect. It protests with a grinding squeal as I force it open, the sound cutting through the afternoon quiet like fingernails on a blackboard. The metaphor feels uncomfortably appropriate as I squeeze through the opening and drop down into the darkness below. My phone's flashlight reveals a typical school basement concrete floors, exposed pipes running along the ceiling, the lingering scent of industrial cleaning supplies mixed with something mustier, older. The air is cooler here, and it moves in ways that suggest the building is still breathing, still alive in some fundamental way, despite its abandonment. I find the stairs and make my way up to the main floor. The hallways stretch in both directions, lined with empty lockers that hang open like hungry mouths. My footsteps echo strangely here, each sound seeming to last a moment longer than it should, as if the building is tasting each noise before deciding whether to swallow it or let it fade. The classrooms are exactly what I expected. Rows of empty desks, their metal legs creating geometric shadows in the dust, moted light that streams through grimy windows. Motivational posters hang askew on the walls, their cheerful messages about teamwork and perseverance rendered somehow melancholy by the context. In one room, I find a globe still spinning slowly when I touch it, as if it's been waiting all these years for someone to set it in motion again. But it's the third classroom I enter that stops me cold. The blackboard at the front of the room is covered in chalk writing. Not the usual abandoned building graffiti, no names or crude drawings or declarations of love. Instead, the board is filled with what looks like a lesson in progress. Mathematical equations cover the left side, their numbers precise and carefully formed. On the right, there's a paragraph about photosynthesis, complete with a detailed diagram of a leaf's cellular structure. And in the center, in handwriting that looks fresher than the rest, 2 words quick: leave. I stare at the message, feeling my heartbeat accelerate. The chalk dust around the words is disturbed, as if someone has just finished writing them. But that's impossible. The school has been empty for over 5 years, according to my neighbors. The doors are chained shut. I came in through the basement, and I'm certain I'm alone here. I reach out to touch the letters, and the chalk is still slightly damp. My finger comes away white with fresh dust. A sound from the hallway freezes me in place, the soft squeak of chalk against blackboard. Someone else is here, writing on another board somewhere in the building. The sound comes again, a series of quick scratches like someone writing rapidly. Then silence. I creep to the classroom door and peer out into the hallway. Nothing. Just the rows of lockers and the afternoon light slanting through windows that need washing. But the smell has changed. The musty air now carries a faint trace of chalk dust, sharp and clean and somehow urgent. Another classroom door stands open across the hall. I know it was closed when I walked past it moments ago, but now it gapes like a mouth, darkness pooling beyond the threshold. Against every instinct that's kept me safe for 3 decades, I cross the hallway and step inside. This blackboard is covered with writing too, but the message is different, as coming. Hide now. My skin prickles with sudden cold. The handwriting is the same as the previous message, hurried, urgent, but unmistakably fresh. I spin around, checking the corners of the room, but I'm alone. The silence presses against my eardrums like water, so complete that I can hear my own pulse, my own breathing, or the subtle rustle of my clothes as I turn. Then I hear footsteps in the hallway. Heavy, measured steps that don't hurry, don't hesitate. They echo off the lockers and tile floors with the confidence of someone who knows exactly where they're going. Someone who belongs here in a way that I definitely do not. I look around the classroom desperately. There's nowhere to hide except under the teacher's desk, a ridiculous option that makes me feel like a child again, and playing hide and seek with older siblings who always found me too easily. But the footsteps are getting closer, and the blackboard in front of me suddenly blooms with new writing, the chalk moving by itself in quick, frantic strokes. Behind the filing cabinet. Now, I don't stop to question how this is possible. I squeeze behind the tall metal cabinet in the corner, just as the footsteps reach the doorway. Through a gap between the cabinet and the wall, I can see into the classroom. A figure enters tall, wearing what looks like a janitor's uniform. His keys jangle softly as he walks, a sound that reminds me viscerally of elementary school. Of that particular anxiety that came with being caught somewhere you weren't supposed to be. He moves to the blackboard and stares at the message there for a long moment, his head tilted as if he's listening to something I can't hear. Then he reaches up and begins to erase the words, his movements slow and deliberate. The chalk dust falls like snow, accumulating on his shoes and the floor below. When the board is clean, he turns and walks to the next classroom, his footsteps resuming their measured rhythm. I wait until the sound fades completely before emerging from my hiding place. The blackboard is clean now, showing no trace of the urgent warning that had been there moments before. But as I watch, new words begin to appear, written by an invisible hand in that same urgent scrawl. Hay erases the warnings. You have to remember them yourself. I back toward the door, my heart hammering. This is beyond rational explanation, beyond anything my ordered, suburban life has prepared me for. But the chalk continues to write, and I find myself reading despite my terror. This happened to others. They forgot to leave. Now they help write the warnings. The warnings. I whisper to the empty room and immediately regret making any sound. The chalk pauses, as if it heard me. Then it continues. It collects the ones who don't listen. They become part of the school. They write warnings for the next visitors. A chill that has nothing to do with the building's temperature runs down my spine. I think about the handwriting on the boards, hurried, frightened, but somehow familiar. As if I've seen it before, in my own notebooks, my own hasty scribbles during boring meetings. "Who are you?" I ask the moving chalk. The writing stops. For a moment, there's only silence and the dust motes dancing in the afternoon light. Then slowly a single word appears. "You." I stagger backward, knocking into a desk. The metal leg scrapes against the floor with a sound like a scream, and immediately I hear the footsteps returning, moving faster now, no longer measured and patient but urgent, almost running. The chalk writes frantically, different timeline, same choice. Leave Nadowers. I don't wait to see what else it might tell me. I run from the classroom, down the hallway toward the basement stairs, the sound of approaching footsteps driving me forward like a physical force. Behind me, I can hear the janitor's keys jangling. But now they sound wrong, too many keys, too heavy, creating a discordant music that makes my teeth ache. The basement window seems impossibly far away, the concrete stairs stretching longer than they should. But finally I reach it, hauling myself up and through the narrow opening with a desperation that tears my jacket and scrapes my hands raw against the rough concrete. I don't stop running until I reach my house, 3 blocks away, only when I'm safely inside. With all the doors locked and the familiar sounds of suburban evening around me, do I allow myself to think about what happened? But even as I try to rationalize it away, old buildings make strange noises. Shadows can play tricks on the eyes. A stress can cause hallucinations. I find myself walking to my kitchen and picking up a piece of chalk I use for my small blackboard shopping list. Without consciously deciding to do it, I write on the board, "Warning received. Will not return." The chalk feels warm in my hand, almost alive. And when I finish writing, I could swear I see other words beginning to appear below mine, in different handwriting. Thank you. Maybe this time it will be enough. I throw the chalk away and avoid looking at the blackboard for the rest of the evening. But when I finally work up the courage to check it before bed, both messages have been erased, leaving only a clean black surface that reflects the kitchen light like still water. That night, I dream of classrooms filled with blackboards, and on every one, different people are writing warnings in desperate chalk handwriting. They all have my face, but they're older, tired, wearing clothes from different decades. In the dream, I understand that they're all versions of me who didn't leave quickly enough, who ignored the warnings or couldn't find their way out before the janitor with the impossible keys found them first. I wake before dawn, and the first thing I do is check my kitchen blackboard. It's still clean, reflecting the early morning light streaming through the window. But in the chalk tray below it, I find fresh dust, as if someone has been writing and erasing messages all night long. I don't write shopping lists on that blackboard anymore. Sometimes, though, when the afternoon light slants through my windows at just the right angle, I think I can see faint traces of words trying to form on its dark surface. Warnings, maybe, or please, or simply the accumulated wisdom of people who learn too late that some buildings are more than just buildings. Some empty spaces contain more than just emptiness. The abandoned school still sits at the end of Maple Street, and I still walk past it, sometimes on my way to the grocery store. The windows reflect the sky like blank eyes, and the ivy continues its patient work of reclamation. But now I notice things I missed before. How the building seems to lean slightly toward the street, as if listening for approaching footsteps. How the front door chains have been arranged in a pattern that might be coincidental, or might spell out letters if you know how to read them. And sometimes, on quiet afternoons when the light is just right, I can see shadows moving behind the dusty windows. Figures in old-fashioned clothes, writing frantically on blackboards that no one will ever see, leaving warnings that will be erased before the next visitor arrives. I don't go near the building anymore, but every time I pass it, I whisper a quiet thank you to whoever wrote that first message. Whoever used their last piece of chalk to warn a stranger to leave quickly, to not make the same mistake they had made. The chalk was still warm when I touched it. Even now, months later, I remember exactly how it felt beneath my fingertip, alive, urgent, desperately hopeful that this time, just this once, someone would listen. Story 5. The evening had settled over the abandoned fairgrounds like a heavy blanket, bringing with it the kind of silence that makes you aware of your own breathing. I had come here following a remembered childhood memory, a searching for the place where my family had taken me decades ago, when the lights were bright and the air was filled with laughter and the smell of cotton candy. Now, the rusted gates hung open, secured only by a chain that had long since been cut. Weeds pushed through cracks in the asphalt, and the ticket booths stood empty, their windows dark and reflecting nothing but my own uncertain face in the fading light. I walked deeper into the grounds, my footsteps echoing off the abandoned structures. Game booths stood like empty shells, their prizes long since claimed by time and weather. The carousel horses sat motionless on their posts, paint peeling from their flanks, their glass eyes staring at nothing. But it was the Ferris wheel that drew me forward, that massive circle of metal and memory rising against the darkening sky. It had been the centerpiece of the park when I was young, the ride that lifted you high above the world and showed you everything spread out below, like a miniature kingdom. The wheel stood perhaps 50 feet tall, its gondola swaying gently in what should have been evening breeze. I say should have been, because as I stood at its base, looking up at the intricate metalwork and faded paint, I realized that the air was completely still. Not a whisper of wind disturbed the tall grass around my feet. Not a single leaf rustled on the nearby trees. And yet the Ferris wheel was turning. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the great wheel rotated clockwise, its gondolas creaking softly as they moved through their ancient arc. The sound was rhythmic, hypnotic, a gentle squeaking of metal against metal that seemed to create its own melody in the silence. I stood transfixed, watching the impossible movement. Each gondola swayed slightly as it reached the top of the wheel, paused for a moment as if surveying the abandoned landscape below, then began its descent back toward the earth. The motion was so gradual that I had to focus on a single car to confirm that it was actually moving. The ticket booth for the ride stood nearby, its window clouded with age and dust. Inside, I could see the shadowy outline of the control panel, its switches and buttons frozen in their final positions. But the wheel continued its slow revolution, operating according to some mechanism I couldn't understand. I approached the loading platform, where passengers once waited in excited anticipation. The metal platform was solid beneath my feet, and I could hear my footsteps ringing against it in the still air. A gondola was approaching the loading position, swaying gently as it descended from the apex of its journey. The car came to rest at the platform with a soft sigh of hydraulics that seemed impossible given the abandoned state of the machinery. Its door hung open, inviting me inside with the same hospitality it had offered to countless riders over the years. I hesitated. Every rational part of my mind screamed warnings about the safety of a decades-old ride operating without power or supervision. There was something about the gentle persistence of the wheel's motion, the patient way it had presented me with this opportunity, that seemed to override my caution. I stepped into the gondola. The seat was worn but comfortable, and as soon as I settled into it, the car began to move. The door remained open. There was no safety bar, no operator to check that I was secure. But somehow I felt completely safe as the wheel carried me upward into the darkening sky. The sensation was exactly as I remembered from childhood, the gradual lifting away from the ground, the expanding view of the world below, the feeling of being suspended between earth and sky. But there was something else now, something that hadn't been there when I was young. As the gondola rose higher, I began to see things that shouldn't have been there. Lights flickered in windows of buildings that I knew were empty. Cars moved along roads that led nowhere, their headlights cutting through the gathering darkness. People walked along pathways that existed only in my memory of how the park used to be. I could hear them, too. Faint sounds of laughter and conversation drifted up from below, mixed with the distant music of carnival rides and the calls of barkers advertising their games. The air carried the scent of popcorn and funnel cake, sweet and warm against the cool evening. But when I looked directly at any of these phenomena, they would fade, leaving only the empty grounds and rusted equipment I knew were really there. It was only in my peripheral vision that the park came alive, only when I wasn't trying to see that the past reasserted itself. The wheel carried me to its highest point, and I paused there, swaying gently in the still air. From this vantage point, I could see for miles in every direction. The abandoned park spread below me like a map of forgotten dreams, but beyond its borders, the world seemed different somehow. The highway that had brought me here was gone. Instead, I saw rolling hills covered in grass that moved in waves despite the absence of wind. The distant city was a collection of lights that pulsed and shifted like a living thing. The very sky above seemed deeper, filled with stars I had never seen before. I closed my eyes and listened. The wheel's mechanism creaked softly beneath me, a sound like an old rocking chair or a ship at anchor. But underneath that, I could hear something else a-whispering, as if the wind that wasn't blowing was trying to tell me something important. The whispers grew clearer as I descended on the wheel's far side. They were voices, dozens of them, perhaps hundreds, all speaking at once in tones too soft to understand individually, but creating a chorus that seemed almost familiar. They spoke of summers that lasted forever, of childhood fears that proved to be nothing more than shadows, of the sweet terror of being carried high above the world on a wheel that never stopped turning. I opened my eyes as my gondola reached the bottom of its arc, and for a moment, just a moment, I saw them. Other passengers in the other cars, faces I recognized from decades past. There was the girl with pigtails who had ridden next to me when I was 8. There was the elderly man who had shared his cotton candy with a crying child. There was my own father, younger than I was now, waving at me from across the wheel's diameter. But when I blinked, the gondolas were empty again, swaying with their own weight as they continued their endless journey. The wheel carried me up again, and I began to understand that this was not simply a ride. It was a mechanism of memory, a device that allowed the past to bleed through into the present, if only for those brave enough to step aboard. Each revolution brought new glimpses of what had been, new whispers of voices that had long since fallen silent. I rode for what felt like hours, though the sky never grew completely dark. Each time I reached the top, I saw a different version of the world below. Sometimes it was the park in its heyday, blazing with lights and filled with families. Sometimes it was the park as it was being built, with workers in hard hats guiding the wheel's assembly. Sometimes it was something else entirely, a field of wheat, a native gathering place, a forest that had stood here long before humans arrived with their dreams of flight. And always, the wheel turned in the still air, powered by something that had nothing to do with electricity or hydraulics. It turned because it needed to turn, because somewhere in its metal memory, it remembered what it was like to lift people toward the stars and show them that the world was larger and more mysterious than they had ever imagined. When I finally stepped off the gondola, my legs were unsteady, and I wasn't sure how long I had been riding. The night had deepened, but not in the way nights usually do. Instead of growing darker, it had become more luminous, filled with a soft glow that seemed to emanate from the wheel itself. I walked back through the abandoned grounds, but now I could hear the echo of my footsteps, layered with other footsteps from other times. I could smell the ghost of carnival food mixed with the scent of rust and decay. I could see, just at the edge of my vision, the flicker of lights that existed only in memory. Behind me, the wheel continued its slow revolution, carrying its invisible passengers on their eternal journey. I could hear it creaking softly in the distance, a lullaby of metal and time that seemed to promise that it would always be there, always turning, always offering its gift to those who were willing to trust in its impossible motion. As I reached my car, I turned back once more to look at the wheel. For just a moment, I could see it as it truly was, not an abandoned ride in a forgotten park, but a great mandala of memory, a prayer wheel spinning in the still air, keeping alive all the moments of joy and wonder that had ever occurred within its shadow. I drove away, but I knew I would return. The wheel had shown me something important, something about the way the past persists in places where dreams once flourished. It had reminded me that some things continue to turn even after their purpose has been forgotten, even after their operators have gone home, even after the world has moved on to newer, brighter attractions. And sometimes, late at night when the air is very still, I imagine I can hear it in the distance, the gentle creaking of the Ferris wheel, as it carries its cargo of memories around and around, lifting them toward the stars, showing them that the view from above is always different than the one from below, always more beautiful, always more true. Story 6. The fluorescent lights above hummed their familiar tune as I walked down the empty hallway of my office building. It was past midnight, and I was the only one left working on the quarterly reports. The sound of my footsteps echoed off the polished floors, creating a rhythm that seemed to follow me like a shadow. I needed caffeine. My eyes burned from staring at the computer screen for hours, and my head felt heavy with exhaustion. The vending machine on the third floor had become my salvation during these late nights, standing there like a loyal sentinel filled with promises of temporary alertness. The machine glowed in the darkness of the corridor, casting rectangular patches of light on the walls. Its gentle electrical hum grew louder as I approached, almost welcoming. I could hear the soft whir of the cooling system inside, a sound that had become as comforting as a lullaby over the months of working late. I reached into my pocket and felt the familiar weight of quarters against my fingertips. The metal was cool and smooth, and I rolled them between my fingers as I stood before the machine, studying my options. Energy drinks lined the top rows, their bright labels promising instant revival. Below them, sodas arranged themselves in neat, colorful rows. The coin slot waited patiently, a dark mouth ready to accept my offering. I selected my usual, a cola with extra caffeine, and began feeding quarters into the machine. 1, 2, 3. Each coin dropped with a satisfying metallic clink, and I could hear them tumbling down the internal pathways of the machine. But as I reached for the fourth quarter, something felt different. The coin slot seemed deeper somehow, as if it had expanded since my last visit. I leaned closer, squinting in the fluorescent glare, but the shadows inside made it impossible to see clearly. I dropped the final quarter, but instead of the familiar clink, there was silence. A profound, unsettling silence that seemed to swallow the sound completely. The machine's hum continued, but something in its tone had shifted, becoming lower, more organic somehow. I pressed the selection button for my drink. The machine whirred to life, and I could hear the mechanical arm inside moving to retrieve my purchase. But the sounds were wrong. Instead of the clean, precise movements I expected, there were softer sounds, shuffling, rustling, almost like fabric brushing against fabric. I bent down to the dispensing slot, waiting for my drink to appear. The slot was a dark rectangle, and I could see nothing inside. But I could hear something moving, something that sounded almost like breathing. Then I saw it. A hand. A human hand, pale and slender, emerging from the depths of the machine. It moved slowly, deliberately, holding a can of cola. The fingers were long and graceful, with perfectly manicured nails that caught the fluorescent light. The skin was smooth, almost luminous, and completely unfamiliar. I stepped back, my heart hammering against my ribs. but the hand continued its emergence, followed by a wrist adorned with a delicate silver bracelet that tinkled softly as it moved. The sound was musical, hypnotic, like wind chimes in a gentle breeze. The hand extended the can toward me, offering it with a gesture that was both elegant and impossible. I could see the condensation beading on the aluminum surface, proof that the drink was real, cold, exactly what I had ordered. I stood frozen, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. The hand waited patiently, unwavering in its offering. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears, a rapid drumming that seemed to sync with the machine's electrical hum. "Take it," a voice whispered, though I couldn't tell if it came from the machine or from inside my own head. The words seemed to float in the air around me, soft and insistent. "You paid for it. Take what is yours." My own hand trembled as I reached toward the offered can. The air between us felt thick, almost viscous, as if I were moving through water. When my fingers brushed against the cold aluminum, a jolt of electricity shot through me, but not painful. More like recognition, like coming home. The unknown hand released its grip, and I found myself holding the can. It was perfectly ordinary, bearing the familiar logo and promises of refreshment. But it felt heavier than it should have, weighted with something more than liquid. I looked back at the dispensing slot, but the hand was withdrawing now, a sliding back into the darkness of the machine. As it disappeared, I caught a glimpse of what might have been an arm, clothed in fabric that shimmered like silk in the artificial light. The machine settled back into its normal hum, as if nothing had happened. The fluorescent lights continued their steady buzzing overhead. Everything was as it had been, except for the impossible cold weight of the can in my hand. I opened the drink and took a sip. It tasted exactly as it should, sweet, caffeinated, familiar. But as the liquid touched my lips, I could have sworn I tasted something else, something metallic and strange, like the flavor of dreams. I returned to my desk, but I couldn't concentrate on the reports. My mind kept returning to that pale hand, those graceful fingers, the silver bracelet that had caught the light. Who did it belong to? Where had it come from? And why did it feel so familiar, as if I had seen it before in some half-remembered dream? Over the following nights, I found myself returning to the vending machine more frequently than necessary. I would stand before it, feeding it coins, selecting drinks I didn't really want, hoping to see the hand again. But the machine dispensed my purchases normally, mechanically, without any trace of the impossible. Yet sometimes, in the corner of my vision, I thought I glimpsed movement within the slot. And occasionally, when the building was very quiet and I was very tired, I could swear I heard breathing coming from inside the machine. I began to notice other things. The bracelet I had seen on that mysterious wrist. I started seeing similar ones in jewelry store windows, on the arms of strangers in crowded streets. Each time, my heart would skip, and I would study the wearer's face, searching for some connection to that night. The hand haunted my dreams. I would dream of reaching into dark spaces, finding it waiting for me, always offering something I needed, but was afraid to take. Sometimes it was a drink, sometimes keys, sometimes objects I couldn't identify, but knew were important. I began to question my own memory of that night. Had it really happened? Or had exhaustion and caffeine withdrawal created a vivid hallucination, The more I thought about it, the less certain I became. Reality and imagination blurred together like watercolors in rain. But the can? I still had the can from that night. I kept it on my desk, empty now, but somehow still meaningful. Sometimes, when I held it, I could feel an echo of that electric recognition, that sense of coming home to something I had never known I was searching for. Weeks passed, then months. I changed jobs, moved to a different building, but I couldn't stop thinking about vending machines. Every time I saw one, I would approach with a mixture of hope and dread, feeding it coins, waiting for that impossible hand to appear again. And sometimes, late at night, when I was alone and the world was very quiet, I would press my ear to the glass of a vending machine and listen. Most of the time, I heard only the expected mechanical sounds: motors, fans, the quiet hum of electricity. But occasionally, just occasionally, I thought I could hear something else. Something that sounded almost like breathing, or like someone waiting patiently in the darkness, ready to offer me exactly what I needed, if only I was brave enough to take it. The question that haunts me now is not whether the hand was real. The question is whether it's still waiting, somewhere in the network of machines that feed our daily hungers, ready to emerge when the moment is right. When someone needs something they cannot name, something that can only be given by a stranger in the dark, I wonder if it's waiting for me to return, or if it has moved on to offer its mysterious gifts to someone else. And I wonder what would happen if I found it again. Would I have the courage to take what it offered, or would I stand there forever, trembling on the edge of an impossible exchange? The machines are everywhere, humming their electric songs, waiting to serve us. But now I know that sometimes they serve us in ways we never expected, offering gifts from hands we cannot see, from places we cannot understand. And sometimes, late at night, I still hear that voice whispering in my memory, "Take it. You paid for it. Take what is yours." Story 7. The fluorescent lights hummed their familiar tune as I pushed through the glass doors of the fast food restaurant. It was one of those anonymous chain places that dot every highway, with its predictable red and yellow color scheme and the lingering smell of French fry oil that seemed permanently embedded in the walls. The clock above the counter read 11:47 p.m., and I was one of only 3 customers in the place. I hadn't intended to stop here. My original plan had been to drive straight through to Cincinnati, but hunger and fatigue had conspired against me somewhere around mile marker 127. The interstate stretched ahead like a dark ribbon, promising hours more of solitude and truck stop coffee. So I'd taken the exit almost without thinking. The teenage worker behind the counter had the glazed expression of someone counting down the minutes until closing time. Her name tag read Ashley, in cheerful letters that seemed to mock the late hour and her obvious exhaustion. "Welcome to, can I help you?" she asked, stumbling slightly over the corporate greeting she'd probably recited thousands of times. "Just a number 2, medium," I replied, fishing for my wallet. "And coffee if you have any made." "The coffee's been sitting for a while," she warned, already moving toward the register with practiced efficiency. "That's fine. Black is fine." As she processed my order, I became aware of the restaurant's night sounds. The gentle hiss of the soda machine cycling, the distant clatter of someone cleaning in the kitchen, the low murmur of a television playing somewhere out of sight. There was something almost hypnotic about these background rhythms, a mechanical lullaby that made my eyelids feel heavy. "That'll be $8.47, Ashley said, and I handed her a $10 bill. While waiting for my food, I wandered over to the children's play area. It was closed for the night, of course, its colorful plastic playground equipment casting strange shadows under the security lighting. But something caught my eye on one of the nearby tables, a forgotten Happy Meal box, sitting perfectly upright as if someone had just stepped away for a moment. The box was slightly faded, as if it had been sitting there longer than just one evening. I found myself drawn to it, perhaps by nostalgia, or perhaps by the simple human tendency to investigate abandoned objects. As I got closer, I could see that the meal was untouched. The apple slices were still sealed in their plastic bag, the milk carton unopened, the small hamburger wrapped neatly in its paper. But it was the toy that made me stop breathing. It was a small plastic picture frame, the kind of cheap promotional item that companies sometimes include in children's meals. But inside the frame was a photograph, and the child in that photograph was unmistakably me. Not someone who looked like me, not a child who resembled me. It was me at perhaps 7 or 8 years old, wearing the same dinosaur tee, shirt I'd worn to picture day in 2nd grade, the same crooked smile, the same cowlick that my mother had tried unsuccessfully to tame with water and hair gel that morning. Even the background was correct, the generic blue backdrop that the school photographer had used that year. My hands were shaking as I picked up the frame. The plastic was warm to the touch, as if it had been held recently. I turned it over, looking for some explanation, some indication of how a 25-year-old school photograph had ended up in a Happy Meal toy in a restaurant I'd never visited before. On the back, in faded blue ink, someone had written, "Don't forget to smile." The handwriting was familiar in a way that made my stomach clench. It looked like my mother's handwriting, but that was impossible. My mother had been dead for 3 years, and she'd never written those words to me. At least, not that I could remember. Sir, your order's ready." Ashley's voice seemed to come from very far away. I slipped the picture frame into my jacket pocket and walked back to the counter on unsteady legs. The bag she handed me was warm and slightly greasy, carrying the familiar smell of processed food that should have been comforting, but instead made me feel slightly nauseous. "Thanks," I managed, my voice sounding strange even to my own ears. As I turned to leave, Ashley called out again, "Hey, did you want that Happy Meal too? The one you were looking at?" I turned back to her confused. "I didn't order a Happy Meal." She shrugged, already losing interest. "Someone left it on the table earlier. Thought maybe it was yours since you were looking at it. We'll just throw it out when we close." "No, that's fine. Just leave it." But as I walked toward the exit, I couldn't help but glance back at the play area. The Happy Meal box was still sitting on the table, but now it looked different somehow. Empty. As if whatever strange energy had drawn me to it had dissipated the moment I'd taken the photograph. The drive to my motel was a blur of streetlights and late night radio static. I kept feeling for the picture frame in my pocket, reassuring myself that it was real, that I hadn't imagined the whole bizarre encounter. The plastic was still warm against my fingers, still carrying that inexplicable heat that seemed to pulse gently like a tiny heartbeat. My room was on the second floor of a chain motel, identical to thousands of others scattered across the interstate system. Generic carpet, generic bedspread, generic landscape print bolted to the wall above the headboard. But as I sat on the edge of the bed and pulled the picture frame from my pocket, even this anonymous space seemed to shift and change around me. Under the harsh fluorescent bathroom light, the photograph looked even more impossible than it had in the restaurant. Every detail was perfect, down to the small chip on my front tooth that I'd gotten falling off my bicycle the week before picture day. I could even see the slight smudge on my cheek where I'd unsuccessfully tried to wipe away chocolate milk before the photograph was taken. But there were subtle differences that hadn't been visible in the dim restaurant lighting. The background, which I'd remembered as solid blue, actually had a faint pattern, a repetitive design that looked almost like tiny hamburgers and French fries. And in the corner of the photograph, partially obscured by the frame's edge, I could make out what looked like part of a company logo. The familiar golden arches. This photograph had been taken at a McDonald's, not at my elementary school. But that was impossible. I'd never had my school pictures taken at a fast food restaurant. No school would do that. And yet the evidence was right there in my hands, printed on photo paper that felt authentic, aged in a way that suggested decades rather than hours. I set the frame on the nightstand and tried to think rationally about what was happening. There had to be a logical explanation. Perhaps someone had found an old photograph of me and, for reasons I couldn't fathom, had it made into a toy. But who would do such a thing? And how had they obtained a photograph I didn't even remember being taken? As I lay in the narrow motel bed, staring at the ceiling and listening to the air conditioner's rhythmic cycling, I found myself remembering other things. The fragments of memory that didn't quite fit together, like puzzle pieces from different boxes that had somehow gotten mixed together. I remembered being 7 years old and begging my mother to take me to McDonald's after getting my school pictures taken. But I also remembered having my picture taken at McDonald's instead of at school, standing in front of a backdrop they'd set up in the play area while other children waited their turn. Both memories felt equally real, equally true, despite their obvious contradiction. The frame on the nightstand seemed to glow softly in the darkness, though I knew that was impossible. There was no light source that could cause such an effect. But every time I turned my head toward it, I could swear I saw a faint luminescence emanating from the photograph itself. Sleep came fitfully, filled with dreams that felt more like recovered memories than unconscious fantasies. I dreamed of birthday parties at McDonald's that I'd never attended, of happy meals that contained toys I'd never owned, of photographs being taken in play areas, while the smell of French fries filled the air and children laughed in the background. In one particularly vivid dream, I was 8 years old again, sitting across from my mother in a restaurant booth. She was younger than I remembered her. Her hair still brown instead of the gray it had become in her later years. She was smiling at me with infinite patience as I played with the toy from my Happy Meal, a small plastic picture frame that I kept opening and closing, fascinated by the way it clicked. "Make sure you keep that safe," she said in the dream, her voice carrying the distinctive echo of memory. "You'll want to remember this day." "Why?" Dream me asked, still clicking the frame open and closed. "Because someday you'll need proof that this really happened." When I woke, pale morning light was filtering through the motel's thin curtains. The picture frame was still on the nightstand, still glowing with that impossible inner light. But now I could see something I'd missed the night before. Inside the frame, behind the photograph of my 7-year-old self, was another image. Faint, almost transparent, but definitely there. It was a photograph of me as an adult, taken from a distance. I was standing outside the fast food restaurant from the night before, clearly visible through the glass doors. In the background, I could make out the play area and the table where I'd found the Happy Meal. And sitting at that table, just barely visible in the frame, was a small figure that looked remarkably like a 7-year-old child. I dressed quickly and drove back to the restaurant, though I couldn't have explained why if anyone had asked. The morning shift was just beginning, and the place had a different energy than it had the night before. Brighter, busier, filled with commuters grabbing coffee and breakfast sandwiches before continuing their journeys. The play area was open now, filled with the cheerful chaos of young children burning off energy before long car rides. But the table where I'd found the Happy Meal was empty, freshly wiped down and ready for new occupants. I approached the counter where a different employee, a middle-aged man with tired eyes and the bearing of someone working his second job, was taking orders. "Excuse me," I said, feeling foolish even as I spoke. "Last night there was a Happy Meal left on one of the tables in the play area. Do you know what happened to it?" He looked at me with the polite confusion of someone who deals with dozens of strange customer requests every day. "We clean the tables every night, sir. Anything left behind gets thrown out." "But did anyone mention finding a toy in it? A picture frame?" "Not that I heard about." "Is there something I can help you with?" I realized how I must sound, a grown man asking about toys in children's meals, clutching a small plastic frame like a talisman. "No, that's okay. Thank you." As I turned to leave, I heard him call out behind me, "Sir, you forgot this." I turned back to see him holding out a Happy Meal box, the same faded box I'd seen the night before. Inside, I could see the same untouched food, the same sealed apple slices and unopened milk carton. I don't think that's mine," I said. He shrugged and set it on the counter. "Well, somebody keeps leaving these around. Third one this week. Same meal every time, same table, never touched. Management's getting a little concerned about food waste. Third one this week. Yeah. Always the same, table 7 in the play area. Happy Meal with everything except the toy. Like someone just takes the toy and leaves the rest. Weird, right?" I stared at the box, my pulse quickening. What kind of toys were in the others?" "Picture frames, I think. Little plastic ones. Nothing special. The restaurant seemed to grow quiet around me, despite the continued chatter of customers and the electronic beeping of registers. I could feel something shifting, some fundamental change in the nature of reality that made the familiar space feel suddenly foreign. "Sir, are you okay?" The employee's voice seemed to come from very far away. I nodded and backed toward the exit, clutching the picture frame in my pocket. As I pushed through the glass doors, I could see my reflection multiplied in the surface, not just one of me, but dozens, each slightly different, each at a slightly different age. And in every reflection, I was holding a small plastic picture frame. The drive home passed in a haze of highway hypnosis and half-remembered dreams. But as I pulled into my driveway 3 hours later, I realized that something fundamental had changed. The house looked the same, but it felt different somehow, as if it belonged to a slightly different version of myself. Inside, I went immediately to the box of childhood photographs that I kept in the hall closet. I'd gone through these pictures hundreds of times over the years, especially after my mother's death, looking for connections to a past that often felt more imagined than remembered. But now, as I spread the photographs across the kitchen table, I found gaps I'd never noticed before. Missing years, missing events, missing moments that should have been documented but weren't. And in several of the pictures that remained, I could see something in the background that I'd never noticed before. The distinctive red and yellow color scheme of a fast food restaurant. The familiar golden arches visible through windows and doorways. As if a significant portion of my childhood had taken place in locations I couldn't consciously remember visiting. The picture frame from the Happy Meal sat in the center of the table, surrounded by these other photographs like a puzzle piece that finally made the larger image comprehensible. But the more I stared at it, the more questions arose. If this photograph was real, if I really had been in that restaurant as a child, then why couldn't I remember it? And if I couldn't remember it, what other parts of my childhood were missing from my conscious recollection? As evening approached, I found myself driving back toward the interstate, though I couldn't have said why. Some part of me needed to see that restaurant again, to verify that the morning's encounter had been real and not some elaborate construction of an overtired mind. The parking lot was nearly empty when I arrived, lit by the same fluorescent lights that had welcomed me the night before. Through the windows, I could see the familiar scene, a few late diners, teenagers cleaning tables, the play area closed and dark. But as I sat in my car, watching the restaurant through the windshield, I became aware of movement in the play area. Small figures, barely visible in the security lighting, moving with the quick, energetic motions of children at play. I got out of the car and approached the windows, pressing my face against the cool glass. The play area was definitely closed, the lights were off, the equipment motionless. But I could still see them, translucent and ephemeral. Children from another time playing games that left no sound. And at table 7, sitting alone with a Happy Meal spread before him, was a small boy who looked exactly like me at 7 years old. He was holding a plastic picture frame, turning it over and over in his hands with the fascination of a child who has discovered something wonderful and strange. As I watched, the boy looked up and saw me standing at the window. For a moment that lasted forever, we stared at each other across the barrier of glass and time. Then he smiled the same crooked smile I recognized from the photograph, and held up the picture frame so I could see it. Inside the frame was a photograph of me as an adult, standing outside this very restaurant, looking in at a child who was looking out at me. The boy mouthed something I couldn't hear through the glass, but I could read his lips clearly. "Don't forget to smile." And as I smiled back, the play area lights flickered on for just a moment, illuminating the space in all its garish, colorful glory. But the tables were empty now, freshly cleaned and ready for tomorrow's customers. The picture frame in my pocket had grown warm again, pulsing gently like a small heart. And somehow, I knew that this wouldn't be the last time I found myself in this parking lot. Looking through these windows at memories I couldn't quite remember, but could never truly forget. Story 8. The fluorescent lights in the hospital corridor buzzed with their familiar electrical hum as I walked toward the exit at 11:47 p.m. Another late shift in the IT department. Another evening spent troubleshooting network issues and updating systems while the rest of the world slept. The pay was good, and someone had to keep the digital backbone of the hospital running. But nights like this made me question whether the isolation was worth it. My footsteps echoed against the polished linoleum floors, creating a rhythm that seemed almost musical in the quiet hallway. During the day, this place was chaos, doctors rushing between emergencies, nurses wheeling patients to and from procedures, families gathering in worried clusters near waiting room chairs. But at this hour, the hospital took on an entirely different character. Peaceful, almost meditative, with only the distant hum of essential equipment and the soft conversations of night shift staff to break the silence. I'd grown accustomed to these midnight walks to the parking garage. The route was always the same, down the main corridor, past the closed gift shop and cafeteria, through the lobby, and out the automatic doors that led to the covered walkway connecting to the parking structure. Simple, direct, familiar. But tonight, as I approached the main exit, something was different. The automatic doors were opening and closing by themselves, not just once or twice, as they sometimes did when the sensors malfunctioned or picked up movement from passing cars. These doors were cycling continuously, opening with their characteristic pneumatic hiss, pausing for exactly 3 seconds, then closing with a soft thump, only to immediately begin the process again. I stopped walking and watched the pattern repeat itself. Open, pause, close, pause, open. The timing was perfectly consistent, as if controlled by some internal clock that had nothing to do with the motion sensors that were supposed to trigger the mechanism. The night security guard's desk was empty, which wasn't unusual at this hour. Martinez often made rounds through the building, checking on the various departments and ensuring that the skeleton crew had everything they needed. But his absence meant I couldn't simply ask him about the malfunctioning doors. I approached slowly, thinking that perhaps my movement would reset whatever glitch was causing the cycle. But as I got within the range where the sensors should have detected me, nothing changed. The doors continued their mechanical dance, utterly indifferent to my presence. Open, pause, close, pause, open. The sound was hypnotic, and I found myself counting the cycles. 10, 20, 30. Each repetition was identical in timing and sound, creating a rhythm that seemed to synchronize with my heartbeat. The soft hiss of the pneumatics had an almost respiratory quality, as if the building itself were breathing through these glass and metal lungs. I pulled out my phone to call maintenance, but the screen showed no signal. That was odd. I'd never had connectivity issues in the main lobby before. Hospital's cellular boosters were specifically designed to ensure coverage throughout the facility, especially near the entrances where emergency responders might need to communicate. As I tried to get a signal, I became aware of something else that was wrong. The lobby, which should have been dimly lit by security lighting, seemed to be getting brighter with each cycle of the doors. Not dramatically so, but noticeably. As if each opening was allowing more light to enter from outside than should have been possible given the late hour and the fact that the parking structure was covered. I moved closer to the doors, trying to see what was beyond them. During the day, the view through these doors showed the covered walkway, the concrete pillars of the parking garage, and the distant glow of the city beyond. But now, each time the doors opened, I caught glimpses of something that didn't make sense. Sunlight, bright. Natural sunlight streaming in as if it were mid-afternoon rather than approaching midnight. The rational part of my mind immediately began searching for logical explanations. Perhaps maintenance was testing new lighting systems in the parking structure. Maybe there was some kind of reflection from the city lights creating an optical illusion. But even as I considered these possibilities, I knew they didn't account for what I was seeing. The light beyond the doors wasn't artificial. It had the quality of natural daylight, complete with the subtle variations in intensity and color that no electric lighting system could perfectly replicate. And with each cycle, I could hear something else sounds that didn't belong to a midnight hospital corridor. Voices. Distant conversations carried on a breeze that smelled of flowers and fresh grass, rather than the antiseptic air that permeated the hospital. Children laughing somewhere far away. The gentle rustle of leaves that suggested trees where no trees should be. I stood directly in front of the sensors, hoping to trigger some kind of reset. But the doors ignored me completely. They continued their cycle, opening on to what was increasingly looking like a different world altogether. A world where it was daytime, where the hospital's covered walkway had been replaced by an open courtyard filled with flowering plants and wooden benches. During one of the longer glimpses, the doors seemed to be staying open for slightly longer periods now. I saw people moving in the distance, patients in hospital gowns, but they looked healthier, more vibrant than the patients I was accustomed to seeing. Some were walking unassisted, others sat on benches in relaxed conversation, and a few were tending to gardens that definitely didn't exist in the hospital's actual landscape design. A woman in scrubs walked past the doors from the outside, moving from right to left across my field of vision. But her uniform was different, cleaner, brighter, with subtle design elements that suggested a more advanced, or perhaps simply different healthcare system. She glanced toward the doors as she passed, and for a moment our eyes met. She stopped walking and turned to face me directly, her expression curious but not alarmed. Slowly, she raised her hand and waved, as if greeting an old friend across a great distance. I raised my hand to wave back, but before I could complete the gesture, the doors closed again. When they reopened 3 seconds later, the woman was gone, and the courtyard looked somehow different more vivid, more real, as if each cycle was bringing this other world into sharper focus. My phone buzzed in my hand. I looked down to see that the signal had returned, but the time displayed made me catch my breath. According to the screen, it was 3:23 a.m. I had been standing in front of these doors for over 3 hours, though it felt like only minutes had passed. Impossible. I looked at my watch and saw the same time, 3:23 a.m. Somehow I had lost nearly 4 hours without realizing it, but I felt fully alert. Not the least bit tired despite the late hour and the length of time I'd apparently been standing there. The doors continued their cycle, but now I could see that the world beyond was transitioning from day to evening. Golden light slanted through the courtyard, casting long shadows that suggested late afternoon. The people in the distance were beginning to gather in small groups, as if preparing for some kind of evening gathering or ceremony. I heard footsteps behind me and turned to see Martinez approaching, his expression concerned. "Hey, everything okay here?" he asked, studying my face with the professional attention of someone trained to recognize distress. "You've been standing here for a while?" "The doors," I said, gesturing toward the still, cycling entrance. "They've been opening and closing by themselves. And there's something on the other side that doesn't make sense." Martinez looked at the doors, and I saw his eyebrows rise slightly. "Yeah, we've had some issues with that sensor lately. Maintenance is supposed to look at it tomorrow." He paused, studying the doors more carefully. "Though I've never seen them cycle like that for so long." "Can you see it?" I asked. The courtyard, the people. He moved to stand beside me, and together we watched the doors open and close. But from his expression, I could tell that he was seeing something entirely different from what I was seeing. "Just the walkway and the parking garage," he said gently, "same as always. Are you feeling all right? You look a little, I don't know, disoriented maybe." Through the next cycle, I saw the courtyard clearly in what appeared to be full evening light. Lanterns had been lit along the pathways, and the people were gathering around what looked like a fountain I'd never seen before. The woman in scrubs was there again, but now she was accompanied by others, doctors, nurses, patients, all of them seeming to participate in some kind of peaceful evening ritual. "I need to go through," I said suddenly, surprising myself with a certainty in my voice. "Through where?" Martinez asked, but I was already moving toward the doors. As I approached, they opened on schedule, and I stepped forward into the space between the sensors. For a moment, I was suspended between two worlds. Behind me, the familiar hospital lobby with its fluorescent lighting and antiseptic smells. Ahead of me, the impossible courtyard with its warm evening air and the scent of jasmine. I could hear Martinez calling my name, but his voice seemed to be coming from very far away. I took another step forward, and suddenly I was standing on grass instead of concrete, breathing air that was warm and humid instead of the climate, controlled atmosphere of the hospital. The people in the courtyard turned toward me with expressions of welcome rather than surprise, as if they had been expecting me all along. The woman in scrubs approached, and I could see now that her face was kind, lined with the gentle wrinkles that come from years of genuine smiling. "You've been watching for a long time," she said, her voice carrying the soft accent of someone from a place I couldn't identify. We wondered when you would decide to join us. Where am I? I asked, though part of me already suspected the answer would be more complex than any simple geographical location. You're in the same place you've always been, she replied, but you're seeing it as it could be, rather than as it is. The hospital exists in many versions across many possibilities. Most people only ever see one version, but sometimes, especially late at night when the barriers are thin, someone glimpses another. I looked back toward the doors and saw Martinez standing in the opening, his face creased with worry. But the hospital behind him looked different now, brighter, newer, filled with the soft glow of advanced technology that seemed almost organic in its integration with the architecture. Is this real? I asked. Reality is more flexible than most people believe, she said, echoing something I felt I'd heard before but couldn't place. This is as real as the version you came from. The question isn't which is real, but which serves the greater good. Around us, the evening gathering was beginning in earnest. Patients who in my world would have been confined to beds were walking freely, their faces bright with health and hope. Doctors and nurses moved among them not as authority figures, but as partners in healing, their relationships characterized by mutual respect and genuine connection. This is what healthcare could be, the woman continued, following my gaze. What it is, in some possibilities. A place of genuine healing, where the focus is on wholeness rather than just the absence of disease. Where the building itself is designed to promote wellness. Where the staff are trained not just to treat symptoms, but to nurture the complete human being. Why am I seeing this? Because some part of you needs to know that this possibility exists. That the work you do keeping the systems running, maintaining the digital infrastructure that supports healing, is part of something larger than you might have imagined. Every choice you make, every problem you solve, every night you spend ensuring that the hospital functions smoothly, contributes to the probability that this version might one day become the primary reality. I felt tears on my cheeks, though I wasn't sure why I was crying. Perhaps it was the beauty of what I was seeing, or perhaps it was the realization that my often solitary work was connected to something so much more meaningful than I'd understood. The gathering in the courtyard was reaching some kind of crescendo. Patients, staff, and what appeared to be family members were joining hands in a large circle around the fountain. But as I watched, I realized that this wasn't just a ceremony, it was a healing circle, with energy flowing visibly between the connected hands like gentle streams of light. You don't have to stay, the woman said softly. But you don't have to forget. Either carry this vision with you when you return to your version of the hospital. Let it inform the choices you make, the problems you solve, the way you interact with the people whose lives depend on the systems you maintain. I looked back at the doors one more time. Martinez was still there, but now I could see other figures behind him, doctors and nurses from my version of the hospital, their faces showing concern for my extended absence. But mixed among them were other figures that seemed to shimmer slightly, as if they weren't quite solid. People from this version, perhaps, reaching across the barrier between possibilities to ensure my safe return. Will I be able to come back? I asked. The doors will cycle again, she said with a smile. Perhaps not tomorrow, perhaps not next week, but eventually. When the barriers grow thin, and someone needs to remember that there are always other possibilities, other ways of being, other versions of reality where healing and hope triumph over fear and limitation. I stepped back toward the doors, feeling the cool rush of air, conditioned atmosphere replacing the warm evening breeze. Martinez reached out and gently took my arm, steadying me as I crossed back into the familiar world of fluorescent lighting and polished floors. "You okay?" he asked, studying my face with professional concern. "You looked like you were somewhere else for a minute there." "I was," I said, surprised by the certainty in my voice. "But I'm back now." The doors had stopped cycling. They stood open normally, responding to our presence the way they were supposed to. Through them, I could see the familiar covered walkway and the concrete structure of the parking garage, exactly as they should be at nearly 4 in the morning. But the memory of the courtyard remained vivid and complete, as if I had lived in that other version of the hospital for years, rather than minutes. And somehow, I knew that my work would be different from now on. Not just maintaining systems, but nurturing the possibility that those systems might one day support the kind of healing I had witnessed. As I walked to my car, I turned back once to look at the hospital building. In the windows of the upper floors, I could see the soft glow of the patient rooms where night, shift nurses were providing comfort and care to people in their most vulnerable moments. But now I could also see something else, a faint shimmer around the building, like heat waves rising from summer pavement, suggesting other versions of the same structure existing in parallel possibilities. The drive home was quiet, but my mind was full of plans. Small changes I could make to improve the digital systems, ways to make the technology more human-centered, methods for ensuring that the hospital's electronic infrastructure supported not just medical treatment, but genuine healing. And sometimes, late at night when I'm working alone in the server room or walking the empty corridors after a long shift, I listen carefully for the sound of automatic doors cycling on their own. Because I know now that those doors are more than just entrances and exits. They're portals between what is and what could be, opening periodically to remind us that reality is far more flexible than we typically dare to believe. And sometimes, if we're brave enough to step through, we can glimpse the versions of ourselves and our world that exist in the realm of infinite possibility. The midnight portal may close, but the memory of what lies beyond remains, guiding our choices and illuminating the path toward a future where healing encompasses not just the body, but the full spectrum of human potential. Story 9. The highway stretched endlessly before me, a ribbon of asphalt disappearing into the heat shimmer of the desert horizon. I had been driving for hours, maybe longer. Time seemed to lose its meaning on this stretch of interstate that cut through the heart of nowhere. The radio had given up its signal miles ago, leaving only static and the hypnotic hum of my tires against the pavement. It was the kind of drive that makes you forget you're moving at all. The landscape outside barely changed: scrub brush, distant mountains, an occasional billboard advertising services for towns I would never visit. The sun hung at that perfect angle that made the asphalt ahead look like water, a perpetual mirage that retreated as fast as I approached it. I drove in the right lane, maintaining a steady 70 miles per hour, my hands resting lightly on the steering wheel. The monotony was almost meditative, and I found my mind drifting to the meeting I was driving toward, the presentation I would give, the life that waited for me at the end of this endless road. That's when I first noticed the car in the oncoming lane. It was traveling in the opposite direction, as cars should on a divided highway. But something about it caught my attention, made me glance across the median strip for a second look. It was the same make and model as mine, a blue sedan, identical down to the small dent in the front bumper that I had acquired in a parking lot months ago. I shook my head and focused on the road ahead. Coincidences happened. There were thousands of cars like mine on the highways, and it was only natural that eventually I would see one that looked similar. But as I continued driving, I found myself watching the oncoming traffic more carefully than I had before. Another blue sedan passed, heading in the opposite direction. Then another. Each one looked exactly like mine, down to the smallest details. Same color, same year. The same small imperfections that I had thought were unique to my vehicle. The license plates were too distant to read clearly, but they all seemed to have the same configuration of letters and numbers. I pressed slightly harder on the accelerator, as if speed could somehow outrun the growing unease that was settling in my chest. The landscape outside remained unchanged, but now I was acutely aware of the traffic in the opposing lanes. Car after car passed me, all of them identical to mine, all of them traveling with the same measured pace. The really disturbing part came when I began to see the drivers. At highway speeds, it's usually impossible to get a clear look at someone driving in the opposite direction. But something about the angle of the sun, or perhaps the perfect straightness of the road, allowed me glimpses through the windshields of the oncoming vehicles. And what I saw made my hands tighten on the steering wheel until my knuckles went white. The drivers all looked like me. Not similar. Not reminiscent. Identical. The same face, the same posture, the same expression of mild concentration that I knew I wore when driving long distances. Each one had their hands positioned on the steering wheel exactly as mine were positioned. Each one wore the same clothes I was wearing. I told myself it was an optical illusion, a trick of light and distance, and the hypnotic effect of long-distance driving. But as car after car passed, the certainty grew that I was looking at myself, over and over again, traveling in the opposite direction on the same highway. I reached for my phone to call someone, anyone, to ground myself in reality. But the screen showed no signal, and when I tried to place a call, all I heard was the sound of static that might have been breathing. The fuel gauge showed 3 quarters full, but I decided to stop at the next service area anyway. I needed to get out of the car, to walk around, to convince myself that the world still made sense. But as I scanned the horizon, I realized I couldn't remember seeing a single exit or service area for miles. The highway continued unbroken, as if it had been designed to go on forever. I checked my speedometer and confirmed that I was still traveling at 70 miles per hour. My GPS had lost its signal along with my phone, showing only a blue dot in a field of gray, as if I were driving through unmapped territory. But I was certain this was Interstate 40, The same road I had traveled many times before. Another cluster of blue sedans approached in the oncoming lanes. This time, I forced myself to look directly at the drivers as they passed. The speed of our combined approach should have made it impossible to see faces clearly, but somehow I could make out every detail. Each driver had my face, my expression, my exact posture. Each one was looking straight ahead, focused on the road, seemingly unaware of my presence. But as the fourth or fifth car in the group passed, the driver turned his head slightly and looked directly at me. I saw my own eyes looking back at me, my own mouth forming what might have been words I couldn't hear. The contact lasted only a fraction of a second, but in that moment, I was absolutely certain that I was not looking at an optical illusion or a coincidence. I was looking at myself, driving in the opposite direction, aware of my presence just as I was aware of his. My hands began to shake on the steering wheel. I eased off the accelerator, thinking that perhaps if I slowed down, the phenomenon would stop. But the oncoming traffic maintained its pace, and the parade of identical cars continued. Blue sedan after blue sedan, each carrying a version of myself toward some destination I couldn't imagine. I tried to remember when I had first gotten on this highway, when I had last seen a road sign or landmark that I recognized, but my memory seemed foggy, unclear. I remembered starting my journey, remembered the purpose of my trip, but the details were becoming increasingly vague, as if they were happening to someone else. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that reflected off the windshields of the oncoming cars. But instead of the setting sun being ahead of me or behind me, as it should be on an east-west highway, it seemed to be directly overhead, neither rising nor setting, but simply hanging there like a spotlight illuminating this impossible road. I began to experiment. When I raised my right hand from the steering wheel, I watched the oncoming traffic carefully. Sure enough, one of the approaching drivers also raised his right hand, mimicking my movement exactly. When I adjusted my rearview mirror, another driver made the same adjustment. When I turned on my headlights as the sky darkened, a stream of oncoming cars did the same. The realization came slowly, like dawn breaking over a landscape I had never seen before. I was not simply seeing other drivers who looked like me. I was seeing myself reflected in some cosmic mirror that ran down the center of this highway. Every action I took was being performed by the figure in the oncoming lane. Every breath I drew was being drawn by my reflection as it traveled in the opposite direction. But if that were true, then where was I going? And where had I come from? I tried to remember my starting point, the place I had left that morning, or perhaps days ago. The memory was there, but it was like trying to recall a dream upon waking. The harder I concentrated, the more it slipped away. I knew I had a destination, a purpose for this journey, but those details too were becoming increasingly unclear. The highway continued its straight line through the desert, lit now by the unchanging sun and the headlights of the endless stream of identical cars. I began to understand that this was not a road that led from one place to another. This was a road that existed for its own sake, a loop or a Malbaya strip that allowed travelers to encounter themselves, to see their own journey from the other direction. Hours passed, or perhaps days. Time had lost all meaning on this highway where the sun neither rose nor set, where the landscape never changed, where the only constant was the stream of my own reflection, traveling in the opposite direction. I no longer tried to understand how this was possible. I simply drove, maintaining my steady pace, watching myself approach and pass in an endless cycle of recognition and departure. Sometimes, the other versions of myself would wave. Sometimes they would mouth words that I couldn't hear, but somehow understood. Sometimes they would hold up objects, a coffee cup, a photograph, a key, as if trying to remind me of something I had forgotten. I began to wave back, to mouth my own words, to hold up my own objects in response. We were having conversations across the median strip, communications that transcended the physics of opposing traffic and the barriers of time and space. We were sharing memories, experiences, of fragments of the life we were all living simultaneously. The fuel gauge continued to show 3 quarters full, no matter how far I traveled. The engine ran smoothly. The tires never wore down. The car never showed any signs of the thousands of miles I was certain I had driven. This highway existed outside the normal rules of wear and decay. A place where the journey could continue forever, without the usual concerns of maintenance and refueling. I realized that I was no longer trying to reach a destination. I was no longer worried about the meeting I was supposed to attend or the presentation I was supposed to give. Those concerns belonged to a different version of myself, one who lived in a world where highways led somewhere, where time moved forward in a straight line, where reflections stayed safely on the other side of mirrors. Here, I was part of something larger and stranger. I was participating in an endless dialogue with myself, a conversation that explored every possible version of who I might be, every path I might have taken, every choice I might have made differently. The other drivers, the other versions of me, seemed to understand this as well. We drove with a sense of purpose that had nothing to do with reaching a destination and everything to do with the act of traveling itself. We were pilgrims on a highway that existed in the space between reality and possibility, between memory and imagination. And so I continued driving, watching myself approach in the oncoming lanes, sharing silent communications with the other versions of my existence. The highway stretched endlessly ahead and behind, a perfect loop of asphalt and possibility, where every journey was also a return, where every departure was simultaneously an arrival, where the traveler and the destination were one and the same. Sometimes, in the corner of my vision, I thought I saw other highways intersecting with this one, other travelers driving different cars, having their own impossible encounters with their own reflections. But whenever I looked directly, there was only the single road, the single stream of blue sedans, the single conversation being held across the median strip of infinity. I drive still, perhaps. Or perhaps I stopped long ago and am only remembering the feeling of movement, the sensation of wheels against pavement, the endless approach of my own reflection. In this place where time has no meaning and distance is irrelevant, the distinction between memory and experience, between driving and dreaming, becomes as unclear as the horizon that shimmers always ahead, always out of reach, always promising that the next mile will finally reveal where this highway leads and why I am traveling upon it. Story 10. The morning walk through Riverside Park had become my ritual, as predictable as sunrise and as necessary as breathing. Each day at 7:30, I would leave my apartment and follow the same path along the winding walkways that curved beside the slow, moving river. The routine grounded me, gave structure to days that had become increasingly shapeless since my retirement. The park was usually quiet at that hour, populated only by dedicated joggers and the occasional dog walker. I preferred it that way. The solitude allowed me to think, to process the strange dreams that had been plaguing my sleep, to prepare myself for another day of freedom that sometimes felt more like emptiness. My favorite bench sat beneath an old oak tree, positioned perfectly to catch the morning light as it filtered through the leaves. I had claimed it as my own over the past several months, stopping there each morning to rest and watch the river flow past. It was a peaceful spot, removed from the main paths, surrounded by the gentle sounds of water and wind and the soft conversations of birds in the branches above. But this morning was different. As I approached my bench, I could see something lying on its weathered wooden surface. A newspaper, folded neatly and placed precisely in the center of the seat, as if someone had left it there specifically for me to find. The paper looked fresh, crisp, with none of the dampness or discoloration that would have accumulated overnight in the morning dew. I slowed my pace, studying the paper from a distance. It was unusual to find anything left on this particular bench. It was too far from the main thoroughfares to be a casual dropping, isolated to be a common resting place for other park visitors. Someone had deliberately placed it there, but who and why? As I drew closer, I could see the masthead clearly. The Metropolitan Herald, a paper I recognized but had never read regularly. The date showed today's date, confirming that this was indeed the morning edition. But what struck me most was the photograph on the front page, a picture of my own neighborhood, taken from an angle that showed my apartment building clearly. I sat down beside the newspaper, careful not to disturb it immediately. The bench felt different somehow, as if the presence of the paper had changed its fundamental nature. The wood seemed cooler against my back, and the morning sounds around me grew muted, as if the world were holding its breath. With trembling fingers, I unfolded the paper and began to read. The headline was simple, direct, and impossible. Ao Kalo Ras Eden Dight. Below it, in smaller text, was my name. My full name, spelled correctly, followed by my address and a brief description that could only refer to me. The article was short, matter of fact, written in the style of an obituary, but placed on the front page like breaking news. I read the words again, certain I was misunderstanding something, that this was some kind of mistake or elaborate prank. But the details were too accurate, too specific. The article mentioned my recent retirement from the accounting firm where I had worked for 37 years. It described my daily walks through Riverside Park, my habit of sitting on this particular bench. It even mentioned my cat, Whiskers, and the small garden I maintained on my apartment's balcony. The article went on to describe the circumstances of my supposed death. The deceased will be found in his apartment at approximately 11:30 p.m., having passed peacefully in his sleep after experiencing what appeared to be a series of increasingly vivid dreams. There will be no signs of struggle or illness, and the death will be ruled natural causes. My hands were shaking as I held the paper, and I had to set it down on the bench to keep from dropping it. This was impossible. Newspapers didn't predict deaths. They reported them after they had occurred. This had to be someone's idea of a sick joke, but the production values were too high. The details too accurate for it to be a simple prank. I looked around the park, searching for someone who might be watching, waiting to see my reaction to this macabre discovery. But the pathways were empty except for a jogger in the distance and an elderly woman walking her small terrier near the river's edge. Neither seemed to be paying any attention to me or my bench. I forced myself to read the article again, looking for clues about who might have written it or how they had obtained such personal information about my life. But the byline showed only staff reporter, and there was no indication of the article's source or methodology. The strangest part was how normal the rest of the newspaper appeared. The other stories were typical. Political developments, sports scores, weather forecasts, local events. Everything else was perfectly ordinary. As if only this one impossible article had been inserted into an otherwise normal edition of the paper. I checked the weather forecast and found it matched what I had heard on the radio that morning. The sports section contained scores from last night's games that I remembered seeing on television. Even the advertisements seemed current and appropriate. Only the front page article about my supposed death stood out as impossible, surrounded by the mundane reality of everyday news. I folded the paper and stood up from the bench, my legs unsteady beneath me. The logical part of my mind insisted that this was some kind of hoax, that someone was playing an elaborate trick on me. But another part of me, a deeper, more primitive part, whispered that perhaps newspapers sometimes knew things they shouldn't know, that perhaps the future occasionally leaked backward into the present through the printed word. I walked home in a daze, the newspaper clutched tightly in my hand. Every sound seemed amplified. The crunch of leaves beneath my feet, the distant hum of traffic, the cheerful greetings of neighbors I passed along the way. The world felt simultaneously more vivid and more fragile than it had that morning, as if I were seeing it through the lens of my own mortality. Back in my apartment, I spread the newspaper on my kitchen table and studied it under the bright fluorescent lights. In the harsh artificial illumination, the impossibility of the situation became even more apparent. The paper was real. I could feel the texture of the newsprint, smell the distinctive odor of fresh ink. But the content remained impossible, a prediction of death delivered as casually as a weather report. I called the offices of the Metropolitan Herald, my fingers fumbling with the phone number listed on the paper's masthead. After several transfers, I found myself speaking to an editor who listened patiently to my explanation before informing me that no such article had been published in that day's edition. "I'm looking at today's front page right now," the editor said, his voice kind but firm. "The lead story is about the new highway construction project. There's nothing about anyone dying tonight." I stared at the paper in front of me, at the headline that was so clearly printed, so undeniably there. "But I'm holding it in my hands," I insisted. "I can read it to you word for word." There was a pause, and when the editor spoke again, his tone had changed slightly. "Sir, Are you feeling all right? Sometimes stress or medication can cause visual disturbances. Perhaps you should speak to your doctor. I hung up the phone and sat in silence, studying the newspaper that apparently existed only for me. The rational explanations were running out. Either I was experiencing some kind of mental breakdown, or I had somehow encountered something that existed outside the normal rules of reality. As the day progressed, I found myself returning to the newspaper again and again, reading the article about my death, as if repetition might make it less real or more comprehensible. The details never changed. The time, the circumstances, the peaceful nature of my passing. It was written with a certainty that felt both comforting and terrifying. I went about my normal routine, or tried to. I fed Whiskers, tended to my balcony garden, prepared a simple lunch. But everything felt different now, charged with the knowledge of what was supposedly coming. I found myself hyper, aware of my body, monitoring my heartbeat, checking for signs of illness or distress. As evening approached, the article's predicted time of death loomed larger in my consciousness. 11:30 p.m. felt both impossibly distant and terrifyingly close. I considered leaving my apartment, going somewhere else, as if geography might invalidate the newspaper's prophecy. But another part of me was curious, almost eager to see what would happen when the appointed time arrived. I called my sister, something I hadn't done in weeks. Our conversation was strained. I wanted to tell her about the newspaper, but couldn't find a way to explain it without sounding delusional. Instead, I made small talk, listening to her voice as if it were music I might never hear again. As the clock approached 11, I found myself growing surprisingly calm. The newspaper's article had been so specific, so certain, that I began to accept it as inevitability. If this was my last night, at least I had been given advance warning. I could prepare, could spend these final hours in contemplation rather than surprise. I sat in my favorite chair, the newspaper open on my lap, watching the clock on the wall tick toward the prophesied moment. Whiskers curled up beside me, purring softly, and I stroked his fur while contemplating the strange gift I had been given, the knowledge of my own ending. At 11:15, I began to feel drowsy. Not ill, not panicked, just peacefully tired, as if my body were preparing itself for the sleep described in the article. The drowsiness felt natural, welcome even, like the end of a very long day. I closed my eyes and found myself dreaming, though I was aware that I was still awake, still sitting in my chair. In the dream, I was back in the park, sitting on my bench. But now it was nighttime and the bench was surrounded by other newspapers, hundreds of them, each folded neatly and placed precisely where someone would find them. I understood, in the way one understands things in dreams, that each newspaper contained a story about its intended reader, that the park was a distribution center for impossible knowledge, for information that shouldn't exist but somehow did. I was not the first person to find such a paper, nor would I be the last. The dream continued, showing me other mornings, other park visitors, other moments of discovery and disbelief. I saw the young woman who found an article about her upcoming promotion. I saw the elderly man who read about his grandson's safe return from war. I saw the child who discovered a story about finding a lost pet. Not all the stories were about death. Some were about beginnings, about changes. about the small miracles that shape ordinary lives. The newspapers were messengers, carrying information from the vast network of possibility that surrounds every moment, every choice, every breath we take. As the clock struck 11:30, I felt a deep peace settle over me. Whether this was truly my last moment or simply another strange experience in a life full of inexplicable events, I had learned something valuable. The future is not fixed, but it sometimes sends back signals, warnings, gifts wrapped in newsprint and left on park benches for those who need to know. I opened my eyes one last time and looked at the newspaper in my lap. The headline was changing, the words shifting and reforming as I watched. Now it read, "A local rasidi MTE experiences pirofo and ravelation." The article below described not my death, but my understanding, my acceptance of the mysterious forces that occasionally breach the wall between what is known and what is possible. It described my recognition that some stories exist before they happen, that some truths are delivered through impossible channels to those who are ready to receive them. I smiled and closed my eyes again, no longer afraid, no longer uncertain whether I would wake in the morning or continue into whatever comes next. I had been given a gift, the knowledge that reality is far stranger and more wonderful than most people ever imagine, and that sometimes, just sometimes, the universe finds ways to prepare us for the changes that lie ahead. The newspaper rustled softly in my lap as I drifted deeper into sleep, its pages turning by themselves in the still air of my apartment, revealing new stories, new possibilities, new tomorrows that existed somewhere in the space between certainty and dream. In the morning, another park visitor would find a newspaper on the bench beneath the oak tree. It would contain their story, their moment of impossible knowing, their chance to glimpse the threads that connect what was, what is, and what might yet be. And the cycle would continue, as it always had, as it always would, in the quiet spaces where the future whispers its secrets to those brave enough to listen. Story 11. The blue glow of the ATM screen cast familiar shadows across my face as I approached the machine. It was past midnight, and the bank's parking lot stretched empty around me, illuminated only by the soft hum of fluorescent lights overhead. I could hear the gentle whir of the machine's internal mechanisms, a sound as comforting as breathing. I inserted my card with practiced precision. The familiar beep welcomed me, and I began typing my PIN. 1479. The same numbers I'd pressed thousands of times before. But as I waited for the screen to load, something in the reflection caught my eye. There was a figure behind me. I turned around quickly, my heart skipping slightly, but the parking lot remained empty. Just my car sitting under the pale light, its windows dark and still. The autumn wind rustled through the nearby trees, creating a soft susurrus that seemed to whisper secrets I couldn't quite understand. Returning to the screen, I selected my usual withdrawal amount, $50, enough for the week ahead. But as the machine processed my request, I found myself watching the reflection more carefully. The dark surface of the screen acted like a mirror, showing me my own familiar face, my brown jacket, my tired eyes, and behind me, clear as daylight, stood someone else. This time I didn't turn around. I studied the reflection intently. The figure appeared to be wearing clothes from another era, perhaps the 1950s or 60s. A long coat. a hat tilted at an angle that obscured the face. The posture was patient, waiting, as if this person had all the time in the world. My hands trembled slightly as I retrieved my cash and card. The machine's mechanical sound seemed louder now, more deliberate. Click where click. Like a heartbeat made of metal and electricity. I could feel sweat beginning to form on my palms, despite the cool October air. I walked slowly back to my car, listening carefully to my footsteps on the asphalt. One set of footsteps, only mine. The sound echoed off the empty building walls, creating a lonely rhythm that seemed to follow me, even after I stopped moving. But as I reached for my car door handle, I heard it, another set of footsteps, slightly out of sync with my own. They stopped when I stopped, started when I started. The timing was just off enough to create an unsettling echo, as if someone was learning to walk by copying my movements. I turned around one more time. The parking lot remained empty, but now I noticed something I had missed before. Under the ATM's soft blue light, there was a second shadow on the ground, longer than mine, cast at an impossible angle. The drive home felt longer than usual. Every red light seemed to last forever, and I found myself checking the rearview mirror more often than necessary. The streets were quiet, lined with sleeping houses and dormant businesses. But at each intersection, I could swear I saw the same figure in my peripheral vision. Always at the edge of my sight, never quite there when I looked directly. Was my apartment building welcomed me, with its familiar creak of the front door and the soft hum of the elevator. But as I waited for the elevator to arrive, I noticed my reflection in the polished metal doors. And there, standing slightly behind and to the left, was the figure from the ATM. This time, I could see the face more clearly. It was weathered, kind, with eyes that seemed to hold decades of patience. The mouth was moving slightly, as if speaking words I couldn't hear. The lips formed shapes that looked almost familiar, like a half-remembered song from childhood. The elevator arrived with its gentle ding, and I stepped inside. The mirrored walls multiplied my reflection infinitely, creating a tunnel of myself that stretched into impossible distances. But in each reflection, the figure was there too, multiplied and repeated, an army of patient watchers accompanying me upward. On the 7th floor, I exited quickly and hurried to my apartment. My key turned in the lock with its familiar resistance, and I stepped into the comforting darkness of home. I flipped on the lights and closed the door behind me, engaging both the deadbolt and the chain. My apartment looked exactly as I had left it. The same books on the coffee table, the same jacket draped over the chair, the same half-finished crossword puzzle on the kitchen counter. Everything was normal, safe mine. But as I prepared for bed, brushing my teeth in the bathroom mirror, I saw something that made my blood run cold. In the reflection, my bathroom looked different. The tiles were arranged in a pattern I didn't recognize. The towels were a color I had never owned. And standing in the doorway behind me, patient as ever, was the figure from the ATM. I turned around, but my bathroom was normal. My tiles, my towels, my empty doorway. I returned to the mirror, and there it was again. The other bathroom, the other version of my life, with the figure standing guard over it all. That night, I lay in bed listening to the familiar sounds of my building. The hum of the refrigerator, the distant traffic, the settling of old wood and concrete. But underneath it all, I could hear something new. Footsteps in the hallway, pacing back and forth outside my door. They were patient, methodical, never stopping for more than a few seconds at a time. I got up and looked through the peephole. The hallway was empty, lit by the same fluorescent bulbs that had been there for years. But I could still hear the footsteps, as clear as my own heartbeat. As dawn approached, I finally drifted into an uneasy sleep. But even in my dreams, I could feel eyes watching me. Kind eyes, patient eyes, eyes that had been waiting for something I couldn't quite understand. When I woke, the first thing I did was check my bathroom mirror. My reflection looked back at me, normal and familiar. But for just a moment, just at the edge of perception, I thought I saw the other bathroom again. The one with different tiles and different towels, and the figure standing patiently in the doorway. I decided to avoid the ATM for a while. I would use the one inside the grocery store instead, or perhaps the one at the mall. Somewhere with more people, more light, more witnesses to whatever was happening. But as I left for work that morning, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the glass door of my building, and there, clear as daylight, was the figure, closer now than ever before. So close I could almost make out the words those patient lips were trying to speak. They looked like my name. The days that followed blurred together in a haze of avoided mirrors and sideways glances. Every reflective surface became a potential window into that other world where the figure waited patiently for something I couldn't provide. Store windows, car mirrors, the surface of my coffee, all of them showed me glimpses of a reality that ran parallel to my own, separated only by the thickness of glass and the fragility of perception. But the figure was getting closer. Each day, each reflection, brought us together by inches. And slowly, I began to realize that the face was becoming more familiar. The eyes, the shape of the nose, the way the mouth moved when forming those silent words. It was a face I had seen before, in old photographs and half-remembered dreams. It was a face that looked remarkably like my own, aged by decades I had never lived. And as I stand here now, writing these words, I can see that figure in the black screen of my computer, closer than ever before, reaching out with patient hands toward a boundary that grows thinner with each passing moment. The mouth is moving again, forming words I'm finally beginning to understand. It's time to come home, and perhaps it is. Perhaps this patient figure has been waiting all these years for me to realize what the reflections have been trying to show me. That somewhere, in some other version of reality, I've been waiting for myself to return. The screen grows darker as I finish typing. My reflection becomes clearer, and so does the figure standing behind me. I can see now that we're wearing the same clothes, separated only by the passage of time and the thin veil of glass that divides one world from another. I close the laptop, and for a moment, everything is dark. When I open it again, I wonder if I'll be on the other side of the reflection, waiting patiently for someone else to find their way home. Or perhaps I've been there all along, and it's taken me this long to realize which side of the mirror is real. A story 12. The train car settled into its familiar rhythm as we pulled away from Penn Station. The steady click, clack of wheels on rails, creating a hypnotic percussion that seemed to synchronize with my heartbeat. I'd taken this route dozens of times, over the years, New York to Boston, a journey that had become as routine as brushing my teeth, but today felt different somehow, charged with an energy I couldn't quite identify. I found my assigned seat, 14A, and settled into the worn fabric with a sigh of relief. The business meeting had run longer than expected, and I was grateful to finally be heading home. Around me, other passengers were engaging in their own travel rituals, laptops emerging from briefcases, phones being checked for the last time before entering dead zones, newspapers rustling as commuters prepared for the 3.5-hour journey ahead. As the train gathered speed and the urban landscape began to blur past the window, I reached into my jacket pocket for my phone. But my fingers found something else first, something papery and unfamiliar. I pulled it out, expecting a forgotten receipt or business card, but what I held made my breath catch in my throat. It was a train ticket. Not just any train ticket, but an old one, printed on the heavier paper stock they'd used decades ago. The edges were yellowed with age, and the text had that slightly fuzzy quality of older printing methods. But what made my hands tremble was the information printed on it. The New York to Boston seat 4th UA, date November 15, 2003 passenger. My name 20 years ago, almost to the day. I stared at the ticket, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The date was impossible. On November 15, 2003, I had been a senior in college, living in Ohio, and certainly not traveling regularly between New York and Boston. I'd never even been to Boston until I was 26, nearly 3 years after the date on this ticket. But there was my name, printed in the same neat font as all the other information. And there was my current seat number, 4th A, as if this ancient ticket somehow knew exactly where I would be sitting 2 decades later. I turned the ticket over, looking for some explanation, some indication that this was perhaps a promotional item or a joke. But on the back, in faded blue ink, someone had written, "Remember the conversation." The handwriting was mine. I was certain of it. The same slightly slanted cursive I'd developed in high school, the same way I crossed my T's and looped my G's. But I had no memory of writing those words, no recollection of any conversation worth remembering from a train trip I'd never taken. The conductor's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing our departure from New York and our expected arrival time in Boston. The sound seemed to come from very far away, filtered through the growing hum in my ears that accompanied my rising confusion. I looked around the train car with new eyes. The other passengers appeared normal enough, business people typing on laptops, students with headphones, elderly couples sharing quiet conversations. But now I found myself studying their faces more carefully, searching for what? Some sign that they, too, were carrying impossible tickets from impossible journeys. The woman across the aisle caught my attention. She was perhaps in her 60s, with silver hair and kind eyes that seemed familiar in a way I couldn't place. She was reading a book, but every few minutes she would glance up and look directly at me with an expression of patient expectation, as if she were waiting for me to remember something important. "Excuse me," I said, leaning slightly toward her. "Have we met before?" She smiled, and the expression was both warm and sad. "We have, dear, though I wouldn't expect you to remember. It was a long time ago, and you were different then." "Different how?" "Younger." more open to possibilities that don't fit neatly into the world as you understand it now. She returned to her book, leaving me with more questions than answers. I studied her profile, trying to place her in my memory, but came up empty. Yet the sense of familiarity persisted, like trying to remember a dream that dissolves the moment you focus on it. The landscape outside the window began to change as we left the city behind. Suburbs gave way to countryside, and the November afternoon light cast everything in golden hues that seemed almost too vivid to be real. I found myself mesmerized by the passing scenery, lulled by the train's steady rhythm and the warm sunlight streaming through the window. Without realizing it, I dozed off. When I woke, the train car looked different. Not dramatically so, the same basic layout, the same seats, the same windows. But the details were wrong. The fabric patterns were from an earlier era, the fixtures were older, and the overall feel was of a train from the 1990s or early 2000s, rather than the modern rolling stock I'd boarded in New York. More disturbing still, the passengers had changed. Some faces were the same, but others were completely different. And everyone appeared younger, not just a few years younger, but decades younger. The businessman who had been working on a modern laptop was now reading a newspaper. His hair thick and dark, instead of gray and thinning. The college-age girl who'd been listening to music through earbuds was now using a portable CD player with chunky headphones. I looked down at my hands and felt the world tilt around me. They were younger too, smoother, without the small scars and age spots I'd accumulated over the years. My wedding ring was gone, and when I caught my reflection in the window, the face looking back at me was my own from 20 years ago. The silver-haired woman was still sitting across the aisle, but now she looked to be in her 40s, with auburn hair and the same patient, knowing expression. She was no longer reading a book. Instead, she was looking directly at me with eyes that held decades of accumulated wisdom despite her younger appearance. "Now do you remember?" she asked softly, and suddenly, incredibly, I did. I was 22 years old, a senior in college, who had somehow found myself on a train from New York to Boston without any clear memory of how I'd gotten there. I was carrying a ticket that seemed to predict a future I hadn't yet imagined sitting in a seat I wouldn't occupy for another 20 years. And across the aisle sat a woman who claimed to know me from a conversation I was apparently destined to forget and then remember again. "This is impossible," I whispered, though even as I said it, the words felt hollow. The evidence was all around me, the transformed train car. My younger body, the weight of memories that existed outside of linear time. "Impossible is just another word for unlikely," the woman replied, "and unlikely things happen more often than most people realize, especially on trains. But how? Why? Time isn't as fixed as you've been taught to believe. It has flexibility, especially in spaces like this, places that exist between destinations, between one state of being and another. Trains are particularly susceptible to temporal anomalies. All that movement, all that energy, all those lives intersecting briefly before diverging again. It creates opportunities. I stared at the ticket in my younger hands. The date was still November 15, 2003, but now it made sense. This was November 15, 2003. I was living it, experiencing it for what felt like the first time, but what was apparently the second time. "What conversation am I supposed to remember?" I asked. She leaned forward slightly, her expression growing more serious. "The one where I tell you about the choices you're going to make. The path your life is going to take. The things you'll gain and the things you'll lose. You're from the future. I'm from your present. Or rather, from the present you left behind when you boarded this train. I'm here to make sure you remember this conversation when you need it most." Over the next hour, though time seemed to move differently in this strange space between past and present, she told me about my future. About the job I would take in Boston, the woman I would marry, the children we wouldn't have, the dreams I would abandon, and the new ones I would discover. She spoke with the casual certainty of someone recounting history rather than predicting the future. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked when she finished. "Because in 20 years, you're going to board this same train, sit in this same seat, and find a ticket that will bring you back to this moment. And when that happens, you'll have a choice to make." "What kind of choice?" "Whether to stay in the past, knowing what you know now, or return to your present, carrying the wisdom of this conversation with you." "That's not really a choice. I can't stay in the past. I have responsibilities. People who depend on me." She smiled sadly. "That's exactly what you said the first time, and it's exactly what you'll say again. But knowing that you have the choice, remembering that this moment exists, changes everything. It means that even when your present feels fixed and inevitable, you'll know that there are other possibilities, other paths, other versions of yourself living different lives. But what's the point of knowing that if I can't change anything?" "Who says you can't change anything? The fact that you're here, having this conversation again, proves that change is possible. Time may be flexible, but it's not arbitrary. You're here because some part of you needed to be here, needed to remember something you'd forgotten." I looked around the train car again. The other passengers continued their activities, reading, sleeping, staring out windows at scenery that seemed to shift between decades with each passing mile. But now I could see that some of them were watching me with expressions of quiet recognition, as if they too had experienced their own impossible journeys through time and memory. "Are they all?" I began. "Time travelers, temporal anomalies, people caught between moments." She shrugged. "Labels don't matter much here. What matters is that you're all on the same journey, moving from one version of yourselves to another. The only difference is how consciously you're participating in the process." The train began to slow, and I looked out the window to see a station approaching. But it wasn't a station I recognized from any of my trips between New York and Boston. The platform was populated by figures from different eras, some dressed in modern clothing, others in fashions from decades past. All of them stood with the patient posture of people, waiting for transportation to destinations that existed outside of conventional geography. "This isn't Boston," I said. "No, it isn't. This is a different kind of destination altogether, a place where all the possible versions of your journey intersect. Do I have to get off here? You have to choose. Stay on this train, in this moment, with this younger version of yourself and all the knowledge you've gained, or return to your original journey, carrying this conversation with you like a secret compass that will help guide your decisions in ways you can't yet imagine. I felt the weight of the decision settling around me like a heavy coat. The train car had grown quiet, and I could sense that all the other passengers were waiting for my answer, as if my choice would somehow affect their own journeys through time and possibility. What did I choose before? I asked. You chose to remember. To carry this moment forward into your future like a seed that would eventually grow into understanding. You chose to trust that even if you couldn't change the past, you could still influence what came next. The train had stopped completely now, and through the windows I could see conductors moving along the platform with lanterns that cast shifting shadows in the amber light of late afternoon. The woman across the aisle stood up and gathered her belongings, but before leaving, she placed something on my seat. It was another ticket. This one was crisp and new, printed on modern paper with contemporary fonts. The destination was listed simply as forward, and the departure time was now. The choice is yours, she said, moving toward the door. But remember, whichever path you take, you'll carry both journeys with you. The question isn't which is real, but which serves you better in the moment when you need guidance most. I picked up the new ticket and felt it warm under my fingers. Around me, the train car was transforming again, details shifting and flowing like water. The older fixtures began to modernize. The vintage fabrics updated themselves to contemporary patterns, and the windows cleared to show familiar landscape, rushing past at increasing speed. When I looked up, the woman was gone. In her seat sat a businessman I recognized from my original journey, typing on a laptop and occasionally glancing at his phone. The college student had returned to her modern earbuds, and the elderly couple was sharing what looked like digital photos on a tablet. But I was still holding both tickets, the impossible one from 2003 and the mysterious one marked forward. And in my mind, clear as yesterday, was the memory of a conversation that had taught me that time was more flexible than I'd ever imagined, that choices echoed across decades, and that sometimes the most important journeys happened not between places, but between different versions of ourselves. The conductor's voice crackled over the intercom again, announcing our approach to Boston's South Station. I looked at my watch somehow. Despite the impossible detour through my own past, we were exactly on schedule. As the train pulled into the station and passengers began gathering their belongings, I made my choice. I stood up, putting both tickets in my jacket pocket, and joined the flow of people moving toward the exits. The new ticket felt warm against my chest, while the old one seemed to pulse with a rhythm that matched my heartbeat. On the platform, surrounded by the familiar chaos of arriving and departing travelers, I felt different. Not younger, not older, but somehow more complete. As if I'd been carrying around a missing piece of myself for 20 years without realizing it, and had finally found it in the most impossible place imaginable. I walked through South Station with purpose, though I couldn't have said what that purpose was. The evening air was crisp when I emerged onto the street, and the city lights were beginning to twinkle in the gathering dusk. But as I waited for a taxi, I became aware of something that made me smile. In the window of a coffee shop across the street, I could see the reflection of the train station behind me. And there, barely visible among the crowds of passengers, was a figure that looked remarkably like a 22-year-old version of myself, holding a ticket and looking around with the bewildered expression of someone who had just experienced something impossible. He caught sight of me in the window and raised his hand in a small wave. I waved back, understanding finally that some journeys never truly end. They just become part of the larger story we tell ourselves about who we are and who we might become. The taxi arrived, and as we pulled away from the station, I reached into my pocket and felt both tickets still there, one from a past I'd forgotten and found again, another from a future that was still being written. Both of them proof that time, like memory, was far more flexible than most people dared to believe. Where to? The driver asked. I gave him my address, but as we drove through the familiar streets of Boston, I realized that I was no longer quite the same person who had boarded the train in New York that morning. The conversation from 20 years ago had changed me in ways I was only beginning to understand. That night, as I prepared for bed, I placed both tickets on my nightstand. In the morning, I knew the one marked forward would be gone, having served its purpose. But the old ticket from 2003 would remain, a tangible reminder that some journeys transcend the ordinary boundaries of time and space. And sometimes, when I ride that train between New York and Boston, I find myself looking carefully at the other passengers, wondering which of them might be carrying their own impossible tickets, their own memories of conversations that happened outside the normal flow of time. Because now I know that trains are more than just transportation between destinations. They're vessels that carry us between different versions of ourselves, temporary spaces where the past and future can meet in the eternal present of motion and possibility. The ticket from 2003 is still with me, still warm to the touch, still bearing those words in my own handwriting. Remember the conversation. And I do remember it every day. As I make choices that echo across time and create the future that young man on the train could never have imagined. Sometimes I wonder if I'll make that journey again, if I'll find myself once more sitting in seat 422A, holding a ticket from an impossible past. And sometimes, in the quiet moments before sleep, I think I can hear the distant sound of train wheels on rails, carrying other versions of myself through the endless network of choices and chances that make up a human life. The conversation continues, even now, in the space between memory and possibility, between the person I was and the person I'm still becoming. Story 13. I find it when I come home from work on a Thursday evening in late October, the kind of day when the air tastes like dying leaves and early darkness. The note is waiting for me on my kitchen table, folded once, placed with careful precision exactly in the center of the wooden surface. The paper is cream-colored, expensive-looking, with a texture that catches the overhead light like skin. My first thought is that someone has been in my house. The doors were locked, I'm certain of that. I have a ritual, an obsessive checking of every latch and deadbolt before I leave each morning. But here it is, this foreign object in my familiar space, positioned with the deliberate care of someone who wanted to ensure I would notice it immediately. I set down my briefcase and approached the table cautiously, as if the note might disappear if I move too quickly. The silence in the house feels different somehow, charged with the lingering presence of an intruder. I listen for any sound. A footstep upstairs, the creak of a floorboard, the subtle whisper of someone trying not to breathe too loudly. But there's nothing except the familiar hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic on the street outside. The note is folded with precision, the crease sharp and clean. I pick it up, and the paper feels warm between my fingers, as if it's been held by someone just moments before my arrival. When I unfold it, the words are written in black ink, in handwriting that makes my breath catch in my throat. It's my handwriting, my exact handwriting. Down to the particular way I loop my G's and the slight rightward slant of my letters. The penmanship I've carried with me since childhood, as distinctive as a fingerprint, as personal as my own voice. The message is brief, written in the careful script I use when I want to be certain of legibility. Don't trust anything you remember from before today. They've been changing things while you sleep. Check the bedroom closet. Check it now. I read the words 3 times, my hands beginning to shake slightly. The handwriting is unmistakably mine, but I have no memory of writing these words, no recollection of coming home early or leaving myself a message. The ink is fresh, still dark and wet, looking, as if the words were written just minutes ago. The house around me suddenly feels less familiar, less safe. Every shadow seems deeper. Every corner potentially hiding someone or something I can't see. I fold the note carefully and slip it into my pocket, the paper crackling softly against my fingers. The bedroom closet. I haven't looked in there in weeks, maybe months. I store winter clothes there, old boxes of photographs, the detritus of a life that accumulates in dark spaces. But now the thought of opening that door fills me with a dread I can't explain. I climb the stairs slowly, each step creaking in a pattern I know by heart. The bedroom is exactly as I left it this morning. Bed made with military precision, a dresser cleared except for a small lamp, and a dish for my keys. The closet door is closed, as it always is, the brass handle gleaming dully in the light from the hallway. I approach it, like I'm walking toward the edge of a cliff. Every instinct telling me to turn around, to leave this alone, to pretend I never found the note. But my own handwriting has given me an instruction, and the compulsion to obey is stronger than my fear. The handle is cold under my palm, and when I turn it, the door opens with a soft sigh of displaced air. At first, everything looks normal. Hanging clothes arranged by color. Boxes stacked with careful efficiency on the upper shelf. But then I notice the smell, a subtle wrongness that makes my nose twitch. It's the smell of someone else's cologne, faint but distinctly foreign, mixed with something else I can't identify. I reach for the light switch inside the closet, and the single bulb illuminates the space with harsh clarity. That's when I see it, on the back wall, written directly on the white paint in what looks like the same black ink from the note. Day 23. Memory replacement successful. Subject shows no awareness of alterations. Proceed to phase 3. The words are in my handwriting again, but larger, more urgent, as if written in haste. Below them, in smaller script, is a list of dates spanning the past month, each one accompanied by brief notations. October 3, moved coffee mug from left cabinet to right. No recognition. October 70, changed route to work. Subject adapted without question. October 12. Replaced favorite pen with identical model. No reaction. October Haftize altered childhood photo in living room. Accepted new version as original. I stumble backward, knocking into a hanging coat that shouldn't be there. A woman's coat. Red wool with brass buttons, smelling of the same foreign cologne. I've never seen it before, but as I touch the fabric, I have a sudden, vivid memory of helping someone into this coat, of fastening those buttons with familiar hands. The memory is impossible, but it feels real, more real, somehow, than the certainty that I live alone, that I've always lived alone. I grab my phone from my pocket and dial my own number, hearing it ring once before going to voicemail. But the voice that answers isn't mine. It's similar. Close enough to fool anyone who doesn't know me well. But there's something slightly off about the cadence, the inflection. You've reached David, the voice says. I can't come to the phone right now because I'm being recalibrated. Please leave a message, and the improved version of me will get back to you. Or the line goes dead, and I stare at the phone in my trembling hands. I dial again, and this time my own voice answers live, not a recording. Hello, David. I say to myself, the words coming from both my mouth and the speaker simultaneously. I've been waiting for you to call. Who is this? I'm you, obviously. The real you. The one who's been taking notes while they work on your memories. They think they've been subtle about it, but I've been documenting everything. I can hear my own voice speaking, but I'm not forming these words. They're coming from somewhere else. Someone else who sounds exactly like me. What do they want? To see if they can create a perfect replacement. Someone who has all your memories, but none of your inconvenient habits. Someone who won't ask questions about the woman's coat in the closet or wonder why his handwriting keeps appearing in places he's never been. The red coat hangs behind me like an accusation. I can smell the cologne, can feel the phantom memory of helping someone into it, but I don't know who she is or why I would care about keeping her warm. The notes, I say. I'm leaving notes for myself. Yes, every day. They reset certain things. Every day, you discover the evidence and think you're going crazy. But some part of you keeps fighting back, keeps leaving warnings. Today you managed to leave one they didn't.